Star Trek 57, M23, take 2.
It's got Star Trek. Episode 28. Deep Space Nine Season 3, Episodes 11 and 12, past tense.
I mean, look at this man. There's no need for him to live like that. With the right medication, he could lead a full and normal life.
Maybe in our time.
Not just in our time. There are any number of effective treatments for schizophrenia, even in this day and age. They could cure that man now, today, if they gave a damn.
It's not that they don't give a damn. They've just given up. The social problems they face seem too enormous to deal with.
That only makes things worse. Causing people to suffer because you hate them is terrible. But causing people to suffer because you have forgotten how to care, that's really hard to understand.
They'll remember. It will take some time and it won't be easy. But eventually, people in this century will remember how to care.
It only makes you wonder, doesn't it? Are humans really any different than Cardassians or Romulans? If push comes to shove, if something disastrous happens to the Federation, if we are frightened enough or desperate enough, how would we react? Would we stay true to our ideals, or would we just stay here, right back where we started?
So the question is why didn't I just get rid of it before? Because I have problems with, I'm a digital hoarder or something. I don't know. I don't think I'm quite a hoarder.
And then you find that you didn't need it at all. It was already just in your brain.
Or alternatively,
you remembered it.
Alternatively, you find you did in fact need it, and your life is effectively ruined because you can't find that one old snippet of a blog post you drafted in 2007.
Precisely to get my thing going.
Back when
again.
they were called weblogs.
Weblogs. Yeah,
weblogs.
But the thing is if they
log covered in spider webs.
If they just randomly disappear, destroy that, and out of your control,
like a hollow log filled with spider webs.
Out of one's control, one can say, well, it was out of my control. Maybe I'll need it, but there's nothing I could do, So you just it's easier to let it go for me then. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying.
Let go of that log.
Let go of that log.
You know what people are saying? People are saying all sorts of good things about this particular podcast that you're listening to.
No,
it is peculiar.
It's got Star Trek
that
podcast.
they are saying such nice things.
Who's saying these things?
All sorts of people.
People say these things.
Nah, we did get a really good review on Apple Podcasts, which tickled me and made me laugh out loud.
Oh yeah, that was a good one. That was an Apple one.
Yeah, it said
those people are more valuable to us.
Sorry, Google Play folks. Enjoy the show. But
I mean, I have an Android phone, but you know how it goes.
You know how it goes.
It's not my fault. It's just business.
It's just business.
Just get rid of them all.
Nothing personal.
Just get rid of them all. It's just business. I don't have a problem with you. I don't think you're a bad person. You could die for all I care.
The headline of this review was White Knuckle Ride.
Yeah.
5 stars. 2 guys talk about Star Trek with a third guy who just smoked a whole bunch of crack.
Was that me?
I read that and I immediately thought, okay, this is A, a brilliant review, and B, it's going to create some consternation, I think, between Dan and Jesse as they try to determine which one of them is the crack smoker. I don't think it's me. It could be me.
It's probably not you.
I don't think it's me.
I'm the one that's usually all revved up and on.
Well, you also
on chemicals.
Cackling in the background.
Well, I can also audibly hear the vaporizer when you're.
You can hear things vaping and lighting.
Yeah, it's all going it's all crackling and going.
Yeah,
Crackling
not like
vapes.
A bong, but like a tobacco nicotine.
And I'm always going like, yeah, that's right, yeah.
And
I think he might have just been referring to it. Just sounded like crack smoking, or he could have meant somebody talked like they were on crack.
It could have just been part of his exuberance was just like, and somebody was on crack, and it was
he's
just so
using
great.
Poetic license.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
to convey his
crack had his poetic license.
Sincere excitement.
Yeah.
I think it meant the sound of crack smoking, which I can only imagine.
I don't know what that sounds like.
I don't either, but it's like they always talk about a crack pipe and crack rocks. So what's it going to sound like when you burn rocks in a pipe? It's going to sound like all like
snake leaf.
It's going to sound delicious.
Well, anyway, we hope we thank him. We thank Oakwood guy. to adding to our growing collection
cool
of
name, too,
reviews. So if anybody out there think you can do better than that, go for it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you can review podcasts. I don't know. Do people review podcasts? Apparently they do.
Oakwood
Wakanda?
I was trying to say Wisconsin.
Wakanda forever.
I was trying to say Oakwood, Wisconsin, but it didn't. It wasn't in the cards for me tonight on that one.
Anyway.
Is that where this fellow is from?
No, it just says Oakwood guy. There's a bunch of places called Oakwood.
Yeah.
Oakwood is a common wood. It's common anywhere that oaks are common.
That's true. It is a common wood.
Where you can find oaks, you can find
And
Oakwood.
there are different types of oaks. around
Oakwood
the
guy.
world.
It's very generic. In fact, it's kind of a scary name because it's generic. Anyway,
He could be your neighbor.
we also heard
There are random names out there that are very common, and it's wonder why. I don't know. Anyways, I'll try not to go too far on a thing.
There was also, before we get into the episode discussion, there was also some interest in being able to purchase merchandise,
Merch,
like
Merchandise.
t-shirts,
merch,
t-shirts and mugs and things like that. So we'll figure that
perch
out.
on this branch while I perch some merch.
The mugs are good.
The mugs are great.
Wait, is
Mugs are good.
okay? So I saw a picture and it was Dan speaking Klingon. Is that an available graphic?
Yes, I will. We'll get the web business together. So
Did
people
you
can
see
go.
the graphic, Jesse?
Well, I saw it on the.
Then it's
internet,
available.
But was that on the cup that you got?
No, because I got
Okay.
yeah.
So you have a cup with my face on it.
So we'll get that together. We'll get that website together eventually. We'll announce it. So anyway, we're responding to your pleas for idle
Responding to
merchandise.
your pleas.
People enjoy that sort of thing.
Responding to your pleas.
So in any case, today we are going to be discussing yet another Deep Space Nine episode. This one from season 3. It's the 2-part episode, Past Tense, episodes 11 and 12
Intense.
from the 3rd season. And
Like the fire at the circus.
Being as diehard a Deep Space Nine fan as I am, and having seen the show so many times, I am somewhat embarrassed to admit that it wasn't until watching ahead of this podcast today that I realized the pun in the title. The past is.
I didn't know. I actually noticed that on my second viewing this past week. I was like, wait a minute.
I was like, you know what?
Yeah.
The past is tense. And I think partly I thought it because I was like, you know what's fucking tense is outside right now.
Oh shit.
So I think it put me in a mind to think of the tenseness. And that's,
I was just writing it down.
and I know to our listeners out there, we usually jump around because we like to, bounce around the Star Trek universe and do different shows and different movies and different eras and all that. But even though we did Deep Space Nine last week, we just thought, given what's going on, this was an interesting episode. A lot of people are talking about it, bringing it up on, on Reddit and Facebook, etc., talking about past tense and how it, is very prescient in some ways about what some of the issues are, particularly some of the quotes that we'll discuss and go over. So we decided to go ahead and talk about this episode. So I guess I would start out by throwing it to you guys. What did you think? What did you feel?
How did it make you feel, Dan?
I'm trying to find the name of that guy BC because they said it once near the end, but I don't know how to search for
It
it.
was like Biddle something.
Biddle. It was
Biddle.
Biddle. That's
Yeah, and then
wait, thanks,
Vin.
Jesse. That was fast.
He was played by a guy named Frank Military.
who's a writer or something.
I thought the BC guy was the most ridiculous.
he was absurd. It was kind of awesome. though.
Well, yeah, like
He did that Indiana Jones thing with the hat at the end.
Oh yeah, the
Oh,
hat.
yeah,
and it's like,
right.
and he gave the kid the hat. It's just like, oh come on, like,
yeah.
and you either knew what he was gonna say or like he says it and you're like, yeah, that's what he was gonna say. Like I wasn't sure, but yeah, that's what he was gonna say.
Yeah, and his mouth was always going all like open real wide, and he was all squishing around in different
He was
exaggerated
like
things.
90s to the max.
Yeah, he was a ghost.
Yeah, he was a ghost.
Totally.
Yeah, you got your ghosts, your dims, and your gimmies.
Gimmies.
All of them are just trying to get along. The ghost, it's interesting how they describe the ghost because you're introduced by this BC guy who's, presumably a ghost, and it's kind of confirmed or whatever that he at least associates with them.
It's also a very 90s term for like a bad guy to call them a ghost.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, dude, that Chris guy, who was the rich dude or whatever, when he came up to Dax, and
Yeah.
the first thing he goes is like, "Did you get jacked?"
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's like they don't say Jack now.
Yeah, right.
Well, I
Said it back then.
I think this is
I
a
don't know,
good.
but it was just kind of funny how he was saying
Oh, I
it
know.
too.
I think there's a good entryway into this episode because it is
Get jacked or something.
It is a heavy episode, but there are aspects I think it's worth that are somewhat amusing, some on purpose, and some not so much so.
And he got his tattoos back in the 90s like everybody else.
Oh
Yeah, like
the
everybody.
Asian.
Yeah, that's right. He got a Polynesian, a Maori tattoo, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's a good spot to talk about some of the goofy stuff, before we get into the more heavy stuff.
Okay.
I was going to comment on, for example, the fact that this aired January of '95, and the internet still wasn't really a thing at this point. It was introduced. Some people had access to it. Most people who had access to it, it was through AOL or Prodigy or some other service. It was not yet at the threshold where everyone was like relying on the internet. So they're calling it the net. They're still referring to channels.
And it can't really do that much.
And those computer monitors, they're using CRTs.
Oh, those are hilarious.
And the computers are still envisioned as being like built into desks.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like an ATM or something like built into the wall.
It looked like an ugly ATM.
Can I use your computer terminal?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, built into desks so you can't move because they're going to be stagnant and they're never going to need like new hardware or anything. Right. That was always kind of a funny idea of these awesome terminals. Everyone thought ATMs were just going to take over the way that computers were. Yeah, their internet was all weird. It's like, so it's based on channels, but it's called the net, like you just said, right? I guess
N.
and companies make interfaces to it. So that's basically
the Sanctuary records. They're not on the net for some reason. Like, what the hell is that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's what they use it for. I mean, whatever. The companies.
So it was more similar to when you see the 1950s and 60s, the World of Tomorrow videos, where people are sitting at terminals and like clicking buttons to buy. You click a button and then like a shirt gets delivered to your house.
So the companies they make the interfaces which are like a computer. I think that's actually referred to as an embedded system when you have something like that. Like when you go to the nozzle juice to get the nozzle juice,
internet nozzle juice
for your car. I was thinking that maybe it's the internet, but the internet was like super censored, and it's kind of like TV where it needs approval before something can go online. So really, so they call them channels because they're sticking to this old TV model.
Yeah.
It's really maybe it is just a web page. It's just it's whatever they didn't say it was, but you know what I'm saying? It could just be like a web page. But it's sort of being equated to an interactive television is kind of the approach they took. Where it was completely
and there's some
monitored.
irony to that because one of the core messages of this show is these people not realizing, like when Dax is at that dinner party and they're all like, Europe is falling apart. Good thing that would never happen here. And she's like, oh yeah. I mean, I know she didn't say oh yeah. But she basically was like, oh yeah.
Because like some of those people, they like one guy went skiing in New Zealand and it was all good, but then their ski trip to the Alps or whatever got messed up because of like French like students. Like what were the
protests.
students doing in the Alps protesting? Like
That's a good point, actually.
It was like
maybe they just couldn't get to the
It was
airport.
like Gaullists and neo-Trotskyists.
But the reason why I point out the irony is that the producers of the show obviously still thought they're talking about basically the collapse of the capitalist system,
right.
And meanwhile they're still presenting the future version of the internet as being divided into commercial channels, which was what they were used to. It's a somewhat of a sign of their environment and context. They're TV writers and producers. Definitely. They don't imagine that the world would not have syndicated television channels that you pay for. Anyway,
I was speaking of skiing. Am I ignorant or? Okay, Christchurch. Yeah, it's in New Zealand. It's somewhere in New Zealand. I didn't know that. I'm pretty like
you gotta go there. I want to go there for the Lord of the Rings tour.
Yeah, I feel stupid for not knowing
North
that.
Island and South Island.
North and South.
Actually, forget about the Lord of the Rings
it's a distant
tour.
part of the world. It's not your fault.
I want to.
That dude want to go to
It's supposed to be nice.
Yeah, there's a bunch of reasons to want to go to New Zealand.
Yeah, New Zealand sounds like a cool place to visit. I'm all about it.
So it's not unusual for rich people to go there.
First women's suffrage.
Yeah, so that was the internet. You know,
hey, Dan, that's the internet.
That's the internet. All the police carried shotguns.
The one guy had a worm voice.
The what? The worm? Oh, that little guy with the worm voice.
Dick Miller.
Vin.
Now, Dick Miller is one of the most prolific character actors that's ever been.
Yes.
Basically. And Dick Miller, you'll know him from Gremlins is like a key one, but he shows up in a million different things. So if you do like the IMDb for Dick Miller, then you will be pleased. He was in both Gremlins, right? He was in Gremlins 1 and 2.
Yes.
I think he was all reluctantly, like both in real life and his character, like reluctantly pulled back into the stuff with the
He was
Gremlins.
in Explorers. Maybe he was one of the aliens.
I thought he was good at his. I thought he was good at his role.
The Burbs.
Just
he was in the Burbs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He was in the Burbs. He's really good in the Burbs, actually. And then you've also got Clint Howard,
Yeah, Clint Howard.
Star Trek staple.
He played a character named Grady.
So there was no reason for that scene. That was kind of like Sulu in The Undiscovered Country. It's where it was just kind of pop up, and even I mean, I don't want to compare Clint Howard's role to Sulu's role in Star Trek. I mean, that's not really fair.
Clint Howard like sneaks into another Star
but it's
Trek
just kind
episode.
it's just kind of like Sulu's, of course, super important and amazing and awesome, but they shoehorned him into The Undiscovered Country. And Clint Howard, it's just like it feels like they filmed more and then they cut some out, but they're like, we got Clint Howard, so let's keep him in here.
But George Takei's been in more Star Trek than Clint Howard.
And George Takei.
I'm not even talking about that, Jesse.
Jesse's not even talking about that.
I'm not
even talking.
No, wait, I got to stop on that for a second because my whole point was that I'm not comparing Sulu to Clint Howard. I'm just saying that it felt shoehorned in, and it kind of reminded me of them shoehorning in someone with a bigger name.
I see what you're saying.
Of course, Sulu is infinite, it's impossible to be infinitely more, but it's a substantial amount more important than Clint Howard is. It's just so I don't want to downplay Sulu like that.
George Howard was
George
on,
Takei.
He was on TOS.
I didn't know that.
But Clint Howard's
He was
pretty
as
cool,
a child. As a child, Clint Howard was on TOS.
Yeah,
Right.
he was in.
He has a
that
strong Star Trek presence.
I enjoy Clint Howard's presence in things. He was
in Star Trek Discovery season 2.
It was just a bizarre
That's right.
sort of way of doing it because
Season 1.
Because first Dax is all talking to Chris and just being like, she's talking. It's like, hey, we got to get in there. He's like, I don't know, it'll be a lot of work. She's like, my friends are in there. And then like the next scene, they're doing some other stuff, and then suddenly you see her coming out of a sewer, and then she's walking, and then Clint Howard follows her, and the whole time I'm like, what the fuck just happened? What they had to do is they had to explain what happened later instead of showing what happened. They just kind of retroactively explained it. There was like, the people that got her here took her brooch, and I was like, I didn't know her brooch was missing, but I guess it is now. And then they're saying,
I feel
Clint
that there was
Howard
something filmed that was cut out for time or something.
Right,
And that's the example of a dim. Like that's the only dim you actually meet. So that's a dim.
And we see those two that bring her. Yeah, I mean,
my example.
So there were like two kind of. I don't want to say pointless, but two kind of interactions that I guess the purpose was to sort of add some kind of flavor or substance to like just some kind of give it another something or other to make it more robust with feeling and world building, I guess. I don't know. The hippie scene, that was like the second one. Yeah. And I really liked that was hilarious because
funny.
Because they're smoking pot, man, and then some dudes zoop away, but it was like they were so like O'Brien and Kira that was such a clown show to begin with, but But like that whole scene with the hippies was like kind of like, why was that there? But okay, it's appreciated. Clint Howard one was like, why was that there? And I was like, okay, why not? But it was his whole like, I'm invisible. I was like, okay, I don't know.
I expect that they're probably, we see a lot with the ghosts. We see a lot with the gimmies. And my guess is there probably was supposed to be a slightly more substantial subplot with the dims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that maybe it was cut out somehow. Even if it was just an extra minute or two, you could see
there was like the guy that was drawn on Sisko when they were filling out their...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Sisko was all gentle with him. Yeah. That's a good point because actually what put the riot over the top was because one of the police or the officers, or they call them police. What do they call them? They call them security. Or,
there was some sort of security guard type. So the law enforcement. They were law enforcement.
So
of some
law
form.
enforcement gets in a fight.
The bad guy.
The law enforcement gets in a fight with the dims, or with a dim, and there's just off screen they get in fight with a dim, and they're like, "Oh, well, I was fighting a dim." I was like, "Okay, well, I don't know a bunch about dims other than they've been described as this, and you see them kind of scattered about, and they have a problem with overcrowding. It's making a point about, how people are getting fucked by the system and stuff. But that speaks to your point, Patrick, of maybe there was more before that would sort of give that a little bit, layer that a little more and give you a little bit, be able to relate to the dim a little better or something.
Because a big message, or at least an undercurrent. And it's not the main theme, perhaps, but an undercurrent in this episode, these two episodes, is this idea just of categorizing people, right? So you have these three categories,
right?
And those categories, three categories, is not enough categories to explain people, and as a result, you have both by assumption and by evidence in the show that a lot of what's going on, a lot of the attitudes against these people is because of these categories they've been placed under. You see how the security guards treat each of the 3 different categories very differently just by declaring them or identifying them as one category or the other. They do favors and are nicer to the gimmies, even though they're still like shitheads to them. They're still like, oh, okay, like we'll remember when the lady, the worker said, "Oh, we would have been able to process you really quicker."
Because the system, because the system very obviously doesn't care about the DIMS, and that building, they're only taking care of them there because there's not enough hospitals, and so they're like basically like they're not supposed to be here. What the fuck are we supposed to do with these people?
Who
We're
gives
not
a fuck
trained.
about their forms?
So just like fucking let them sit for a while, even though we can't give them the help they need, and we don't care anymore. You know, and so so that's why with gimmies, it's probably much easier to sort of like. Speak with them and interact with them. That's like, but like the ghosts were interesting. So you think of like the ghosts are they the bad guys? No, what's interesting is the way they described them as people that just weren't able to fit in, and that's a good that's a important distinction.
And that's by the way, that's the term used by the authority figures. Right. An alternative term would be the people who refuse to comply, refuse to adhere to the rules and succumb to the rules.
Right.
And then of course again there's a borderline thing because like the guy Webb, the nice guy with the family, he's sort of borderline because on the one hand he's clearly quote unquote a gimme, just a regular old guy, but he's getting agitated.
Right.
He's getting radicalized by what he's having to endure with his family's suffering, and then that's opened his eyes to sort of the greater suffering of the people around him, and he's associating more with them.
Right. So these 3 categories, and that's a good point about how they sort of describe it one way, but it's also could just be like they're going against
same facts
authority.
but different perspective.
Right, and but the thing they all have in common is that none of them are really in control of their own destiny, and they all suffer from these different, you could call them ailments or whatever, however it's expressed. They've all got a different issue.
Joblessness, mental illness.
Right, and so BC
nonconformity.
BC, I wasn't sure what was going on with that character because at the beginning, he stabbed Gabriel Bell, right?
Yeah, and so but then just stabbed that dude.
But then later on in the episode, he's not a good guy, but he kind of like sort of is almost noble, not really, but you can see him becoming more noble. So is that character development, or is that just kind of like they wanted to show that ghosts can be like sort of tolerable, but they're not necessarily just bad, but they can maybe have a potential for good as well. I don't know, I didn't know if it was just seemed like a sudden. I don't know if I made sense or not.
No, my impression was that because I agree that it is tricky when you set up a character to have just brutally stabbed somebody for no good reason, and to death, right? And prior to that, he and his friends were just beating the shit out of somebody. Yeah. The guy's not a good guy in that sense. But then, of course, it's like, would he have been that way on the outside? Right. Is that how he reacted to be on the inside is one thing. And the other thing is where he still continues to be violent throughout the episode, but it gets less and less as Sisko basically, partly by threatening and partly by convincing him, stops him from doing a number of violent acts. And it seemed that like Sisko's strategy was basically to figure out that this guy is self-interested. Yeah. And if Sisko could convince him through whatever means that his self-interest was best served by not blowing these people's faces off, that then he would avoid it. But then, if that's no longer the case, then the guy might be ready to go.
And it seemed like this BC character was expressing some sort of insecurities in the second episode. There was one where Sisko was basically telling him, he said, don't shoot these people. And then he's like, well, maybe I will, maybe I won't. And then he's like, well, they're the only thing we have to bargain with. And he's like, you think I didn't know that? It's kind of like this, like, oh yeah. And then,
oh yeah.
And there was a part where Sisko was questioning his authority, and he goes like, this is my party, I get to decide who's on the list and who's not. So he's keeps trying to, he got defensive about wanting to go to Tasmania. He talked about going to Tasmania.
I love that. He was like, Errol Flynn was born in Tasmania.
He immediately got defensive about that. And then the last one I remember was when they talk about who's going to be representative, and then Sisko's like, put Webb on there, and he's like, what? He's like, what? You don't think I can be eloquent or whatever, So Sisko is putting him in his place, and he's kind of insecure about it, but But he also is kind of trying to speak on his level and trying not to be too much of a dick. But it's funny, he gets so mad after Bell is dead. Sisko's the one the whole time being like, you know, don't fuck with the timeline. He's that guy. And then guess what? And then so after that, he's pissed. He's freaking out. He's like just so angry. He's so furious at Vin, that law officer and stuff. But at the same time, he's this weird. You're talking about how Webb was sort of walking the line near the end towards being, you know, a ghost. I mean, Sisko, he was straight up all for taking hostages, you know, and that's kind of an interesting line. And it gets brought up in the episode. It's like, you got these hostages. And so like, what's the line, I guess, when you're fighting for people's rights and stuff, and then hostages, even if you're not hurting them, you know? So I don't know. You're a cool guy, that Sisko, huh?
Well, it's the command aspect is what pops out is that, and they play this with Sisko a lot, and they do it with Picard and Kirk. I think they've done it with everybody to a certain degree, that you put somebody in a situation where they're playing somebody else, whether they're undercover or whether just by happenstance they've got to lay low in some alien village or something. And the captains, they kind of can't hide their gravitas and their command capability.
Right.
And sometimes that's a problem, sometimes it's not. In this case, I don't think it was. I think it was just that Sisko was just like, here's the strategy, and I'm saying it in a convincing way, and I look like I might fuck you up because I'm all yelling in your face.
Yeah, the first time I noticed that was when the Dim and the law officer that started the whole thing, when they got in the fight, and then Sisko grabbed the gun. He looked like he was super pissed when they were starting to attack the guard, but
he was all like wrapping up the gunsling, you know, to make it not flap around as much.
Yeah, he was all forceful, so maybe he was just being super forceful, and that's just the way he has to do it.
All right, now I have a question, because I might be going crazy, or it's pareidolia or something, but right at the beginning of the episode, when we see the overhead shot, I think it's at the beginning. It comes up a couple times actually, but there's the corner like near where they beamed in, right? Sort of like you see them walking, and it looks exactly like the corner from a piece of the action.
Oh, I didn't even think about that.
Okay. I was thinking that they used the same, more or less, that set for like 20th century.
A lot of the doors and stuff look similar somehow.
I thought that was,
I mean,
and they've used that for other Star Trek TOS episodes as well, like the one with like where like it's just a bunch of children.
Yeah, Mary.
Yeah,
the obviously for production reasons, it was very good to continue to go back to those back lots and you have access to them.
They were still back there.
For a while, I kept seeing the diner from the end and beginning of Pulp Fiction. I was like, that's that diner. That's that diner. But then I read that it had been like torn down 10 years earlier or something. So it definitely wasn't that diner, but
10 years earlier than what? Because this was 95, Pulp Fiction was 94.
Well, I'm saying like since Pulp Fiction, I've seen movies after that where I
got you.
I'm sorry, I didn't describe
this
it. Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't describe that very well.
I love you, honey bunny.
I love you too, Wishy Bushy. What is it? I love you, Sugar Book. How am I forgetting Sugar Booger?
Yeah, he says I love you too, Woofy Buffy.
Woofy Buffy. I love you, honey.
Any of you fucking pricks move, and I'll shoot every motherfucking last one of you.
She says it different at the beginning than at the end.
Yeah,
quote's a little different. Everyone
that always creeped me out.
So anyway, since then, every once in a while, I was like, movie from the 2000s. I'm like, that looks like the Pulp Fiction, and it wasn't. So, but no, it would make sense because those lots. When I was a kid and found out that most of that shit's just in some big ass warehouse.
Have you ever been to the Seinfeld diner? It doesn't look the same on the inside.
That's what I heard. When I was
I have.
Have you been in there? Did they have a big salad?
No, it was just a diner.
But when I first learned
it was a cramped little diner.
When I first learned that a lot of these outside scenes were filmed in these large warehouse studios, I was like, "Whoa, that's weird."
Yeah.
But no, I've never been in the Seinfeld diner. But
I also thought this episode had some structural similarities to City on the Edge of Forever, in that you have some portion of the crew going back in time. Potentially affecting time in a way that results in changes to the future, and then the portion of the crew is trapped, and like in City on the Edge of Forever, they can't reach the Enterprise because the Enterprise is gone because McCoy has changed the timeline because of saving a woman's life. And in this case, it's very similar setup, except for in this case, the Defiant is protected because of gobbledygook.
This way, the time problem was the other way around. Like in the City on the Edge of Forever, or whatever. It was an issue of I'm back in time, and the Enterprise is not there because in forward in time it's gone. But now like the DS, well, maybe it's not backwards, but it's sideways because DS9 they were like in some weird time bubble, but somehow they were seeing the effects of time.
But the same
changing.
thing happens. Not the same thing. It's not exactly
Like
the same.
usually people aren't present for the things when time changes. I guess that was the excuse they were in their time bubble. But at the same time, like, wouldn't time be constantly changing? You know, as opposed to like, oh, now it went through this other sort of demarcation.
Yeah.
Oh, another big leap. It's not like more smooth. It's just
But in
big
City on the Edge of
sweeping
Forever,
changes.
it's a similar thing where they're on the planet and Kirk and McCoy and Spock, McCoy has gone through and Spock and Kirk can't reach the Enterprise, so they're protected by the Guardian of
So they just
Time.
reused it.
But anyway, so that was a kind of an interesting structural similarity.
half that B plot of them trying to get back was technobabble, and the other
was.
the other was shenanigans.
And it was unusually like Deep Space Nine used a lot of technobabble, but this was a lot. Now it was to overall good purpose, but I'm wondering if they could have cut back some of those scenes and added in what we now have just declared must exist of this lost dim plot line.
Yeah, the Lost Dim.
Yeah, we were saying that it seems like they cut something out with the Clint Howard. Maybe they could put that back in and cut back on some of these time travel shenanigans.
Yeah, no, totally. That would have been appreciated because So what I know about what happened to them is the beam. There's a buildup of chronoton particles that happens from the cloaking device. For some reason, time particles help you cloak. I guess that's what chronoton particles are. They're time bits, time pixels.
Sounds like.
And they have for some reason they help you cloak, and then that gets stuck. They get built up in the ablative armor that the ship's ablative armor matrix.
Yeah, the Defiant is awesome.
Yeah, it is, and so it gets stuck up in there. And so
stuck all the way up in there.
And then what happened is as they were transporting, there just so happened to be a micro singularity like flying through, saying hey, which micro singularities aren't they?
You can't account for that shit. You don't know what's going to happen.
No, but like
that's
that's the whole point. Yeah, right, exactly. That's the whole point of a micro singularity. Is so last I heard is they were sort of this hypothetical thing that Vulcans believed in to describe like
ghosts,
like ghosts. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Ghosts. Basically, it's a ghost came through. Exactly.
But in modern physics, it would be a microscopic black hole. Which I also think evaporate I forget if they evaporate quickly. So, I think I don't know. I ain't no physicist.
Probably. So normally you make adjustments for the chronoton. The singularity went through. It like adjusted it. The transporter beam, because it was going through, it polarized the temporal like matrix or something next to the ablative armor matrix, whatever. But then what happened is the transporter beam was redirected, and it went to go through the chronoton particles. So the transporter beam got redirected to go through chronoton particles by a micro singularity
to a pivotal moment in history.
To a pivotal moment, exactly.
The transporter
which made them go through time.
Is responsible for so much like temporal like disruption.
And the
holodeck does its share
holodeck
as
is
well,
responsible for dream sequences and shit. But yeah, no, it does. The transporter has a lot of issues. So, right, the thing is
even when O'Brien's working it. Even when
O'Brien
it can go wrong.
Yeah, and O'Brien's so confident that he's not even like he didn't ever think that he fucked up. He was like, I didn't fuck up. This is just
a micro singularity.
Yeah, right. But that brings to a point where about the episode sort of like it's all to a pivotal point in time. All this fucked up shit happened. Here's the question again: does it matter? Because no, it doesn't really matter. You could think, but there's no reason to really think it. But you could think that maybe. Well, Sisko was the one that created the Star Trek future because that's what happened the whole time. The whole
right. Was it
Back to the Future
was
thing.
it ever Bell or was it always just Sisko? Right.
Right.
I was wondering that too.
Yeah. So, but then what speaks against that, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at it. When Bashir gets the database, the history of the database, and shows Sisko that look, you're Bell, you're Bell, and he's like, I'm gonna have some explaining to do to Starfleet. It's like, wait,
no, you're not.
Wait, the Starfleet
don't show them.
Well, the thing is Starfleet would have known about that picture since it happened. If anything,
and they didn't care.
If anything, people would have gone to Sisko his whole life and been like, you look like that Bell guy. It wouldn't have been like, sorry guys. They would have been like, what are you talking about? Everyone knew you looked like Bell.
The actor that played that guy was the stand-in for Sisko for like some of the seasons.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. Wow. So anyway,
And his name was John Lendale Bennett.
So I guess the point I was just making there was that what explaining would he have to do?
Okay, first of all,
Everybody would know. It's as far as they're concerned, it's always been like that. So they would just know it's like that, and they would think it was weird that he looked like them. But they always thought that, so no one would have known a difference.
First of all,
and they wouldn't be able to recognize one.
One of my favorite callbacks to that, they call back to that picture, and as I recall, later in Deep Space Nine, as I recall, I think it's Quark talking to Nog. I believe it's Nog, but somebody looks up Gabriel Bell. They're looking through the Starfleet records, and they see that picture of Sisko, and somebody's like, "Doesn't this look like Captain Sisko?"
Okay,
and then Quark,
there you go.
and then Quark is like, "All humans look alike."
Yeah.
Like he's being totally racist about it.
Was that a later? That was
much later.
I guess it
Yeah.
wouldn't make sense to happen before, but
They managed to squeeze Quark into this episode, like at the very beginning, where it gives you like all this. It's like this is what happens. This is all this background.
Yeah, the
color,
Grand Nagus.
Like,
Yeah.
they're going to a great summit to see what's happened, like to talk about what's happening in the Gamma Quadrant.
and that's where
There's Quark is talking about some Nagus business.
that's where Sisko and Quark have a debate over the rule. Not a debate, but they have
They talk about the rules of acquisition.
acquisition.
Well, yeah, because you get to see that he's actually studying up on his rules of acquisition, so he knows, and then Quark's all kind of impressed. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, that's right.
Right. So basically it was like Quark's like, you're in his debt. So, what was it? The 11th rule of acquisition is treat people in your debt like family, exploit them, which is like a funny reversal kind of situation.
Yeah.
Like that's a good one. But then Sisko responded, very diplomatically, just like, yeah, you're right. He does. But remind him of the 217th rule of acquisition is you can't free a fish from water.
Yeah.
So they had
It's a very Zen Buddhist thing.
Right. And so they were having this, what's it called?
Tete-a-tete?
They were having a negotiation basically, and he's saying, I would love him to help him, but by the own rules of the acquisition, it might not be possible for me to help him. So I thought that was just kind of a funny, and Quark looked like a little like, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
So I thought that was I like that. I like that moment. I thought it was neat. I thought it was neat that he beat him at his own game.
It's they're fitting in the whole Deep Space Nine universe as a background to show that it's a continuous story.
But another thing to think about is we're talking about the technobabble and the sort of a framing story, which obviously is not important because the core of the story is this sort of moral tale. It's really a warning. I mean, this is a 1995 warning about how not to do this shit. And obviously in 2020, we still haven't learned our fucking lesson yet, right? But they use this framing, the sci-fi framing thing, and it's something they get a little bit more creative with later on, because if you look at another classic example, Far Beyond the Stars, it's sci-fi, it's designed to tell a moral tale. That's where Sisko sort of is trapped in his mind and is inhabiting sort of this, whether it's a vision from the prophets or a hallucination, of being a black sci-fi writer, I believe in the 50s. And all the characters are playing human versions of themselves. And it's a fascinating tale, very interesting, directed. It's a brilliant episode.
It was directed by who? I'm sorry.
Avery Brooks directed that, and as I recall, and it is really... It's something people should be viewing and discussing these days, I think, because it's such an interesting tale about the lived effects of racism. And it's just so well told and so well acted. But the framing device is much simpler there. It's prophet vision, hallucination, whatever it is. It's just like, bam, here it is. And it doesn't require as much screen time, first of all, to explain it. So that's not eaten up, and it doesn't rely on something that's sort of patently like a little bit ridiculous, which is not a big deal because Star Trek always has these sci-fi technical MacGuffins. That's like a common trope, and that's fine. And the story is served well by it, but it is interesting to see how this is an early season version, and later on they get a little bit more creative and start kind of pulling back on relying on the technobabble.
Right. But I mean, I guess it's a matter of what's the purpose of the technobabble, obviously what's the purpose of anything. But if your technobabble is supposed to be taken seriously, like it's supposed to support a plot, it can be an issue. But this one, it was just so like this is a ridiculous scenario to be in. Like, it was just so, it didn't matter at all, this one, because it wasn't trying, didn't even seem like it was really taking itself seriously. It was just kind of like, yeah, what are you going to
do? You could imagine this episode where whatever happens, transporter accident happens, Sisko and them figure out, okay, it must have been a transporter thing. And then there's a scene where O'Brien and Kira are like, we're going to figure this out. You don't really necessarily have to see them for the rest of the fucking story. And then at the end be like, yeah, we figured it out. Turned out it was this. The story would have more room to breathe, and nothing is lost, in my opinion. Even though I did enjoy, for what they were, I did enjoy the little scenes of them hopping through time. I'm upset that we didn't get to see 2048 because they describe it as some sort of like Mad Max hellhole. The hippie stuff we already talked about. It was silly and funny.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say it's really offensive to both hippies and marijuana consumers because these people look like they're fucking insane. They don't. And by the way, they don't talk. They don't talk because then you don't have to pay them because they're like an extra. You know, you don't want to give people lines because you have to pay them extra. So I'm sure there's a production value. Because why not have the hippie girl say something like peace and love?
I think the dude said wow.
Yeah,
he said wow.
You
He said
don't
something.
get paid for wow.
I think wow is an onomatopoeia. I think it's I think it's an exclamation.
It's like saying.
You gotta draw the line somewhere, I guess.
But when they went back to, what was it, like the 20s or something, or 40s? I forget what it was, when there was that like sort of rich looking dude and his classy wife coming out of, or I don't know, mistress coming out of a, he had his white scarf. And again, they don't say anything because you don't want to pay these people. Right. And then Kira has that weird line where she's like, I broke my nose. And I was wondering, were the actors, the other people, were they playing it as if like their assumption was that Chief O'Brien was her husband and he had whacked her in the nose?
I never crossed my mind.
I don't know if I'm not
His name is O'Brien.
I'm not saying that's how they played it, but it's kind of, and the look on O'Brien's face was kind of like, oh great, now they're gonna think I fucking beat my wife.
I didn't think about that, but now it's like I can't stop.
I broke my nose. I ran into a door.
I couldn't tell if
this is the wrong part of the 20th century for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't tell if them putting tape over her nose was Star Trek kind of poking fun of itself, being like, you just put some tape on your nose. You're a humanoid human, not a humanoid alien, a humanoid non-human.
Now I know they don't have Bashir with them, but at other times they would just like do some surgery.
Right. I was wondering why they didn't do the surgery. Maybe they didn't have time. I don't know, but it seems like
what am I talking about? I'm in a time machine. I'll just go back 10 minutes anyway. Back to the Future. Mm-hmm. It's a fairly popular movie from 1985.
I think I've mentioned it a couple times.
Twin Pine Mall.
Some people are really into Ghostbusters. I like Ghostbusters a lot.
Ghostbusters is great.
Yeah.
But Back to the Future's better.
That's interesting.
That's not that's a subjective statement.
Yeah, I respect that statement.
I love Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
Zool and whatnot.
Yeah.
Gozer. Keymaster. Rick Moranis.
It was them going back in time. All I could really gather from that was when the hippies were there. The only thing I could gather sort of from that is it must have been interesting, sort of a juxtaposition between those riots and then this time of the hippies. It's like, I'm going to this alien. Kira's going to an alien planet, Earth, and on one hand, people are like this. Another one, it's like, wow, look at these people. If you went to an alien planet and some aliens came up to you and were like, and like gave you the flower,
some stone fucking aliens,
like
tumble out of a fucking van.
And if they had gone to other places on Earth at that time, there would have been riots.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, if they had gone instead of to like 1966, if they went to 1968, it would be a very fucking different story.
That's
the hippie shit didn't work out in the end.
That's all I could think they might be going for, but it really just seemed like technobabble and sort of comic relief.
It was. I mean,
it was never. Even though so much is on the line, you never felt stressed out about it.
I think the other lost opportunity, given this how strong the core story is, which is discussing poverty and public policy and law enforcement and sort of this overall cultural criticism of capitalism, which is a frequent message in Star Trek, implicitly or explicitly. I thought they missed an opportunity to have the other timelines they went to speak to that in some way or more directly.
I agree with
the
that.
Hippies are sort of, like you said, kind of evoke a nice time. The 2048 is only described to us as being some sort of hellhole, but it's not correct. It's not the correct hellhole. right? That's not how it's supposed to be. So there's no message from those things that connect to the main story. It's purely a lark that they go to these three.
It's just time hopping.
The rule of three. They just go to three places.
Yeah, right. They do. And then at the end, they don't even try. They're like, and he's like, I got 3 different places. She's like, just pick one.
Rule of three.
It's the right thing.
This is my
there you
best
go.
guess.
Yeah, this is my.
Well, why didn't you guess that first, motherfucker?
I didn't get how they only had enough to go back a few amount of times, but then when they used up all their things, they were allowed to use their transporter to go back in time as long as it wanted. Maybe they could only lock onto a new place. Maybe it was locking on, because they said we only have 5 or 6 times we can do this, and so maybe it was the locking on. So
and
when
there was another lock the next day or something. Like,
so well, I don't know if it was if it was time they didn't have. I don't know what the.
Well, it's like in Rick and Morty when they shift universes, and Rick is like, we can only do this like 3 or 4 times.
Oh yeah,
Because otherwise it gets ridiculous.
yeah. The chronoton particles, I was just wondering how they're used as fuel. If it's the longer you use your
I don't think it's
transporter.
fuel. It could be a byproduct from the cloaking process. Not that it fucking matters.
Yeah.
I mean, we're sort of sidestepping the main core story here.
I don't know where I'm going with that.
The imminent demise of society.
Yeah, okay. I'm really missing the point of this, so I'm sorry.
Well, I figured why don't we chat a little bit about some of the characters we meet, and the first one, of course, is Dick Miller's character Vin.
he's got a worm voice.
Now, Dick
voice.
Dick Miller, we've already said he's not only a really popular. He just died recently, by the way. He's a very popular character actor, but he's a brilliant character actor.
Hey, for a dim, you're pretty smart.
I don't know. He said it like that.
For a dim, you're pretty smart. For a dim, you're pretty.
No,
He's got
that's
that
not good.
He's got that craggly face. But what he does really well, and I think some of it's the writing, but I think a lot of it is coming from Dick Miller, is we're introduced to him and he's kind of a fucking dickhead.
Yeah.
You know, he's treating these people like shit. He's declaring them dims, a subalter, a subgroup of people. And you can imagine
Because they wear different clothing.
yeah,
literally.
and even though
you're talking about Star
they're
Trek.
talking to him. Yeah, but they're talking to him perfectly normally.
Yeah.
And they're acting, so he's presented initially in this way, but over the course of the episode, there's character growth and he grows. And of course he's changed his mind at the end, and he doesn't have a lot to work with in the episode because obviously it's a 2-part episode. His character is limited, but he does have that sympathetic side where
He's Monster Joe in Pulp Fiction. Speaking of Pulp
Oh, yeah,
Fiction, he's
that's-
Monster
yeah.
Joe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And
weird.
He's really good he's playing an asshole, but you don't, sometimes you meet an asshole and you're like, that guy's, he's just a fucking asshole. Other times you're upset that you have to deal with them. You might be aggravated by them, but you get the impression that they've been made this way. Like life has just gotten to them. Right. And that's the impression he gives. Right?
Yeah.
From my view, I don't know if everyone else agrees, but
well, even when he tells them when he takes them in and he gives them some forms and he gives them the spiel, he's like, fill these out, sit down and shut up and basically don't talk to me about anything.
Yeah.
And
If you got a question, don't come to me.
yeah, exactly. And so on the surface, it sounds like, well, that's a dick move, but it's like this is a man who's tired of doing all this stuff. So he's getting it out of the way.
He's part of the system, and like if he decided like to not be a cop and like to not have a job, then he'd be one of these other guys.
Yeah.
Like in the sanctuary.
Yeah.
Just,
Which is
just like the lady. I believe her name is Lee, the one that's processing people. Like same deal.
Yeah.
Like,
she wants to do right. There's a scale. There's basically a scale of people. It's a small scale because we don't meet many of these people, but he's more on the end of, we can't do anything. The world is shit. I'm going to do what I can to get by.
Right.
And then his partner is a little bit more in line with that, but his partner has a wife and kids and he's got shit he cares about. So he's not completely devoid of hope. And then the woman, Lee, I'm
not jokingly.
Yeah.
she was not.
I'm not
joking.
joking, Lee. She clearly still cares, but she feels paralyzed, and she's trying to help people within the constraints that she's given, but she doesn't have a lot of energy for it.
Yeah.
So there is that spectrum there. And I thought that she did a really good job sort of portraying that, because I think that's something you probably folks that know some folks who work in similar industries, work for the government or work for a government contractor who helps with outreach to people, particularly people who are in need and have limited resources themselves, and then you're given limited resources to help them. You're understaffed, you're underpaid, you have way too much work to do, and there's really the fact that you are burdened with this, that you take a job because you want to help people, and then not only can you not help people, you have to sort of participate in their continued destruction of their lives. We're wearing a mask of being a helper. That's got to be crushing.
Yeah, and but when they're in a hostage, and Bashir was he was saying that someday there won't be a need for places like this. Her response was, "I hope you're right. Even though it'll mean I'll be out of a job, I hope you're right." Which was kind of like, I don't know if it's considered ironic, but it seems like it, just because
I've got Alanis Morissette on speed dial.
All right. We'll settle this right here and now. So, because basically saying, if we don't need sanctuary, presumably people won't be in this issue of not having jobs. And here she is saying, even though I'll be out of a job, it's like, well, no, you won't, because you don't need it, so, or you'll have a better job or something like that. So
don't you get it? There aren't any jobs.
So it's kind of funny that she would say that. And, but yeah, she does straight up come around and say, like, yeah, this isn't working. I mean, the Dims, like I said before, the Dims are in another room, and they don't express discontent in the same way that the Gimmies do, is how they're presented. Mm-hmm. So they can just let them sit and chill. And they're like, out of sight, out of mind, which was what Sisko was saying about what happened to Sanctuary in general, is they just want people out of sight, out of mind, because they've given up, right? Because of what they said. So just totally understaffed. Everything seems completely hopeless. And so, yeah.
Speaking of Bashir, like Bashir is funny this episode because he's totally put out by the whole like dystopia, because he's like some kind of engineered human from a seemingly perfect sort of world, and he's like, they're like, I'm sorry, but there aren't any napkins left. And he's like, why am I not surprised?
He's a fancy boy.
He's like, why is everything so shitty here? I'm just not getting it. And Sisko's like, listen, Earth used to be fucked up. He's like, I don't get it. He's just like put out by the whole thing.
The whole episode, he's just completely baffled. He says, I didn't study it because it's too much of a bummer.
Yeah,
well, Sisko is like a 21st century expert. It's like a Civil War expert or something,
Well, Sisko is as they show throughout the well, he loves baseball to start, but Sisko is also very interested in particularly the history of the black diaspora.
Because he's from New Orleans.
Yeah, he's from New Orleans, and he is a fan of history, which is a common trait among Star Trek captains. Picard, of course, is very well known for it, but people often forget that Kirk was also super into history too.
Picard liked things; he liked artifacts. Of course, he liked history in general too, but finding artifacts.
But
most of them are very well read.
I would argue, purposefully or not, that Bashir in this story is effectively playing the role of the sheltered, bubbled white liberal, the white person who has maybe liberal ideas.
It's like, how could anybody let this happen?
Yeah, it's like, I had no idea.
Yeah. And like your statement of, it was, I didn't study it because it was too gloomy.
Yeah.
I ignored it because it depressed me. And I didn't want to see that the world was either once like that or is currently like that. And I think that is a problem many of us have, speaking from the white persuasion, that it's very easy.
It's easy to choose
to ignore,
to
not see things, or to only see them through the limited lenses of the nightly news or tweets on the internet or something like that.
Bashir is kind of a good character to play that role too, because there was when he first came on the first episode, when he first came to DS9, he was like, I want to be where the action is and save all the people. And then it's like when he finds out what war is all about. I mean, he comes around, but he grows up. He grows up, but he's totally has this romanticized view from like TV snippets or whatever.
And I guarantee that happens in real life, like with the people joining the Peace Corps, doing other things. But what's interesting about Bashir's arc, and I think this happens to these same people in real life, they might go into something with sort of naive and romantic intentions, but their intention is still to learn the truth, and they do. or they learn some portion of it. It's just not what they thought. They might face greater challenges than they realized, or they might realize very rapidly that no matter how much energy or creativity they have, that if the structural systems are all against you, that does make it a lot harder as a single person. It doesn't matter how educated you are or how genetically engineered you are to be a genius. You as a single person espousing genius ideas to solve the structural deficiencies of a community or a planet or whatever, it's not necessarily going to be enough. Right. And there's an example of that. It's not exactly analogous. It's not a perfect analogy, but later on in Deep Space Nine, when Bashir and O'Brien get stuck on that world where the Jem'Hadar have given some sort of horrible virus to punish the population because they didn't give their taxes to the Dominion. So they get this virus that once they turn a certain age, they just die. So they can still have babies and they still have people, but their lives are just limited and in pain. And Bashir really wants to cure them. And that's a real growth episode for him because he faces some challenges there and has to learn that it doesn't matter that he's this fancy pants genius with power and agency that some other people don't have. He can't change the rules of the world on his own. But he can make a contribution nevertheless.
So Sanctuary was probably... I'm guessing... I'm trying to think how it would have started. So maybe you get
calling a dump a waste processing plant.
Yeah,
it's
so
a euphemism.
Yeah, right. So
it's there's these old buildings and we'll let the homeless people live there because, it seems like a good idea to begin with.
Yeah, I was thinking it was you're right. There's a lot of homeless people. There's a lot of overcrowding and stuff like that. And then I'm guessing it probably started with open borders. And so it seemed like a great place, sort of here's your place, you can go. They said a lot of places had their own sanctuary. So it was probably started. I'm in one world that I'm thinking of. It could have been. I'm trying to think how it could been started. It could have started as a place with open borders, where they're here, you can go here and hang out. And then over time, it got overcrowded. And then at some point, they decided to close it off to newcomers, but you could still leave. And then at some point, everyone was trying to come in, and still security was super tight, so they wanted to know who was leaving. And at some point, this place that probably started as an open sort of place to go, if you had nowhere else to go, that wasn't so bad. At some point, it went from closed to coming in to closed to going out and coming in.
Right. For your protection, quote unquote.
Right. It's basically, and so how do things progress to get to that point?
It is in some ways an extension of the idea of the quote unquote the projects, right? You create a place where you funnel in people that are perfect. They're human beings. They're perfectly deserving people, but for reasons of racial and in economic inequality, the rest of society decides they just want to limit their association with these folks.
That's what they did in the medieval times with Jewish people in Europe.
Yeah, Jewish ghettos.
They had their own part of town, and
Chinatown.
There was a nice gate for their safety, and they locked them right up.
And the thing is that so that's a good example. That's even a more direct example. But you could see how you create a neighborhood and you build all sorts of social and policy barriers to people leaving that neighborhood in terms of just not being welcome in other parts of town, being harassed by the police, being harassed by the people, so that you end up creating this zone. It's not too much to think taking the next step or two to just say, all right, just put a wall around it. And then we'll not let anyone out, and we'll just keep dumping in new undesirables because society keeps producing quote unquote undesirables at any given time.
Yeah. And when I said, earlier when I said it started as open and then they stopped people from coming in, I didn't mean them I meant people just, I imagine a place where they randomly at first came in and out. And eventually they stopped letting new.
Absolutely.
And then 100%. Eventually got to the point where, But right, that's an interesting point though. There's sort of social policies put in place.
If you look, social, cultural, and policy barriers can be almost as strong as physical barriers. So the physical barrier, again, this is an evergreen content show, but we'll have to mention that the President Trump just put 2 miles of fence around the White House as a physical barrier. He's fencing himself in. because he's scared of these protests. I guess
When he went to
Because
there
he's
was
a pussy.
That's when he went to the church, and then like they
Tear gassed
everybody. So that's
I mean this and.
So you could wave a Bible in front of people.
But that's a physical barrier.
man.
We're already seeing that now. So the physical barrier is only one step beyond social, political.
And you could see how
cultural
easy it is to get trapped in there because, like, okay, so like Sisko and Bashir, they didn't know what the hell was going on because they got like there was a temporal disruption, so they're stuck in there and they're all like, bleh. If they had enough, all they had to do was if they could think about like somebody they could call on the outside world, they could have gotten out of there, but they didn't know because they didn't know where Jadzia was.
Yeah. So
If they had known somebody on the outside, they could have gotten right out of there. But they were just all like, bleh.
Yeah, if you don't have someone who can basically vouch for you, and that's including friends or maybe like a landlord or something to prove you have a house or a job. So if you have no home, no job, basically no contact outside, you just stay in this place. And they treat it like, for example, when they brought Sisko and Bashir in, it was basically treating them like drunken public, which is already kind of a weird law where they can just bring you in,
And also guilty before being proven innocent. Their whole
nice pajamas you guys get.
They were brought in because they didn't have ID on them.
Right.
And as we know, we don't know what it's like in the 1995 vision of the future 2024, but in the United States, you do not have to carry ID. You cannot get arrested for not carrying ID still, even under this current president, right? There's no requirement. You have to have an ID if you're buying certain things. You have to have an ID to drive a vehicle. You have to have an ID to access certain things. That's fine. But you can walk around in front of your house.
They try to make you vote with an ID.
Yeah, and they're getting rid of that
part
too.
Of voter suppression.
I was confused by the ID at the end where Vin just said, "Oh, I'll switch your IDs with some casualties." Were there no like identifying bits of information on these IDs, or are these just cards that if you have the card?
These were lightly laminated cards.
So
they weren't even like well laminated.
Part of the draw of having an ID is, of course, for the obvious, but
didn't even
also
have chip technology.
But also what's good about it is it protects you from other people thinking it's valuable for them. So like if you're walking around this card, someone's gonna mug you for that card, but maybe
so you can get your eggs and toast.
But
it is a really good example of the comedic aspect of some of the predictions that Star Trek makes, because on the one hand, the story they're telling is predicting a 2024 that as we near 2024, with all luck, cooler heads will prevail and we won't reach this stage, but we're certainly moving in this direction.
We're getting there.
And in some ways even worse, because one thing I noticed I wanted to comment on is the quote unquote horrifying riot police who came in. Well, they were there the whole episode, but like really towards the end, they were way less scary than what I'm seeing on the news right now.
Yes,
like
absolutely.
they did not. They were clearly intended to look scary. I always remember them looking like scary future cops. And now I'm watching the news. I'm like, oh no, the real cops are way fucking scarier than these dudes.
Yeah. Sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent on that, is that when Vin was like, hey, give me a gun. I'm just going to go patrol. I'm going to take care of the area.
It's short for Vinny.
Yeah, I know. That was weird. His name was like that. I meant like...
Could be short for Vincent, of course.
Or Vinorino.
Yeah. Or vehicle identification number.
What was the name on Doogie Howser? Vincent
I think it was
Pecorino
just
or something?
Oh.
That was racist.
I don't remember.
Sorry, I didn't mean
that guy was also on The Sopranos.
Was he? Oh, yeah.
Was it racist
later
against
on.
Italians?
I guess. Yeah, because there was a cheese.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yeah. What were we talking about? Oh, yeah, the guns. So he basically got it. He was like this riot police person. I don't know if they said it was National Guard or riot police or what, handed him a gun. I don't know. I'm pretty ignorant about what goes on in a police force, but can you just casually hand other officers your gun? I thought they had to have a pretty... I guess in that time period, it was all pretty chaotic.
Maybe.
It was like
I think you're right, though.
Kind of situation.
Generally, probably not.
Yeah.
And especially not between different levels of police force. And I don't... Again, it wasn't 100% clear, but they did refer to the National Guard.
Yes.
I just don't know if... I'm assuming the guys we saw were National Guard, even though they were dressed more like riot police. And
right.
Not like...
I assume they're National Guard as well, because they're talking about them coming. But yeah. So the people get in this situation. They don't... So... And this is at the beginning when Sisko is just like, nothing. They didn't do anything wrong. They're just people. So, and people lose their jobs, because maybe a large company adjusts their goals, right? So that one guy was basically saying, I had a job at a brewery. They laid people off because they got some equipment. Like... How is that anybody's fault? There's no jobs, or the government changes some laws around. You lose your job. Suddenly, sometimes like some casual business decisions are made, and it just,
Or illegal business decisions that
Yes.
run the company into the ground.
and then suddenly the byproduct is a bunch of people end up in a city prison, you
Yeah.
know? And it's like, it's like if I decided to stop eating like a certain brand of popsicles and I eat so much of them, but suddenly I decide to switch brands of popsicles and I eat billions every day, and then
What
like
kind of popsicles?
fudgesicles.
Where's this analogy going?
Fudgicles?
Fudgesicles?
No, I really want to
Is
hear
it a fudgicle? And then, well, no, it's pretty basic. It's like suddenly I switched brands, right?
You switch to like the orange sherbet.
Yeah, those orange orange cream
Creamsicles.
creamsicles. Is it fudgicle or fudgesicle? Fudgicle. Anyways, so the point is
The
this
audience will write in with their vote. We'll put a Twitter poll.
Lego bricks. So basically, I switched brands from that company more, and because I ate so many of them, they had to lay off a bunch of people, right? Because
Because you're no longer purchasing.
I'm no longer because I eat that many fudgicles
Now, did you eat them, in the traditional oral way?
Well, I mean, I just consumed a lot of them.
We'll leave it at
It's
That's not the
nobody's
imp-
business.
It's nobody's business.
how you consume
consume
your
them. Let's-
fudge sickles.
Okay, and a more realistic example is I run some giant organization and fudgicles, everyone loves fudgicles, but then for some reason, our vice president loves fudgicles, but then our vice president
Yeah, he does.
gets fired and the new vice president doesn't like fudgicles, they like cream zows.
That's what happened to Beavis and Butthead.
Yeah, and so what happens is because this new vice president likes something different, a ton of people lose their jobs and end up in city prison.
Like
Yeah, pretty much.
like Jello pudding pops or something.
Yeah, no. I mean, and the thing is they were mirroring real life and real history, and the key message of this podcast, obviously, is that the prescriptions. Well, they didn't really give any prescriptions, but the lessons were not. We didn't solve the problem in the intervening time since this television show has aired, and in fact, the problem in many ways may be worse depending on.
Seems a lot more dire.
Yeah, you're on your particular perspective, but it goes to the classic example with capitalism more generally, and I'm not an anti-capitalist by any means, but I'm a skeptical of capitalism. It's worth paying attention
He's a capital-O skeptic.
Capital skeptic.
to. Capital skeptic. Sure, and you don't mind if I just take over your company for just a little bit of money.
I'm communist.
I'm going to fire a third of your workforce and sell off your equipment.
I'm
Mitt Romney.
Whoa.
That was what he did. That was his job. No, so, okay.
What were you saying about Beavis and Butthead?
So Beavis and Butthead, remember?
Mitt Romney killed Beavis and Butthead.
Beavis and Butthead came back on air for one season. And
I see what
they
you're
were
doing.
supposed to continue, but the president or whoever, some high-level person at MTV, a new person came in.
Boo,
And-
MTV.
And that person always hated Beavis and Butthead or whatever, and so
fuck
just
that.
canceled the rest.
Fuck that.
Right? So it's an example of something that we don't get to have
Yeah.
as a result of that. But the point I was going to make about the capitalism that goes to your point, Dan, is when you look at the economics of it and the math of capitalism, there is a benefit to companies, particularly large companies, but companies in general. There's a benefit to having a good portion of the society unemployed.
Yeah.
Because you want to have the flexibility to hire workers at a low rate at your leisure.
Because they need a job.
You don't want to be in a situation like, forget about everything with the COVID and the riots and everything and the protests going on right now in DC, which has recently had unemployment rates, as low as 2.5%, 3%. That means that people, if you're an employer in DC and you're trying to get employees, they have the bargaining power because so many people are looking to fill up places. Most companies are understaffed because there's not enough people to fill it because anyone who's looking for a job doesn't guarantee you get the job, but you're in a great position compared to if you're in a situation where there's 10% unemployment, in which case you're going to take the first fucking job that even sniffs your way and you'll take it at a wage that is less than you are worth.
Right.
Because you need work in this system.
And I imagine that some of the ways that these sort of policies or sort of actions, these things that put that situation like that can be they're probably very blatant at some points, very direct, but they're probably some very abstract ways of doing it. It's like, oh, this percentage is going down. What can I do to raise this company's percentage point this much? Well, if I do this tends to happen. And after a while, you like look at numbers and statistics so much that you don't even relate them to what's happening to people.
Absolutely.
So, and it happens so at such a slow rate.
And that happens at
sometimes.
the business level. It happens at the policy level, and it also happens at the citizen level. And it's something we are all, if we really examine ourselves and admit it, at some point in our lives regarding some topic, we are all guilty of abstracting it to such a degree that we cannot implicitly make that connection to the human thing. We can do it if we really think hard about it, but our minds have to be pointed in that direction. We have to be thinking about it.
See a big database and numbers and values and things. Yeah. And
it's like when you read history books and you read, 50,000 people died in this war, 20 million died in that war. The numbers that as they get bigger, weirdly, they become less meaningful because our brains can't fucking manage it. So you can imagine living in a 2024, wearing some hilarious, I was watching with my wife, Jamie, and she was really amused by the future clothes, like the 1995 vision of 2024 still looked really 90s, but just with like slightly different, like, patterns of the, they still have like big shoulder pads and weird
hairstyles
patterned
were still kind of nice.
Yeah, the hairstyles always stay the same, right?
Jamie was like,
or they go off the wall.
Jamie was like, is this guy David Bowie's cousin?
Yeah.
But, they're all talking about skiing in Christchurch and student protests and how it's slightly obnoxious that they couldn't go fucking body surfing or some shit because of, Europe is, quote unquote, Europe is falling apart. Right?
Right. Like, well, duh.
And the thing is those people are not necessarily bad, but they are ignorant.
Yeah,
and they have abstracted.
Aloof.
They know about the sanctuary districts, but the one person, she's all like, "Oh, are they still doing that with the sanctuary?" Right. She doesn't even think about it to the point where she thought they might not even exist anymore.
You have to do something with those,
or at the very least, they're not just dumping people in there. The other guy is like, "Well, of course. What else are you gonna do?"
Right.
But round people up and shove them into a fucking pen.
Yeah. And that was and it was a solid moment when Dax was like, then why are they putting walls around the place? If it's to protect him. It was just it was obvious conclusion, but like, it was a solid point. They talk about how outside of Sanctuary it's all dangerous. And so I'm guessing they're saying that.
They're saying it's dangerous,
right?
In the same way you're saying, oh, it's dangerous for the Jewish people to leave the ghetto, the medieval ghetto,
right? Because it seems like
it's dangerous for the other people,
right? Yeah, exactly.
It's not dangerous for them.
They perceive the danger. It seems like you'd put two and two together that the people out there, like, where are these super rich people living? That's
apparently
not
right
dangerous.
next door.
It's
pretty
dangerous.
much.
It's dangerous for the rich people if these people get out.
So is there? Yeah, absolutely. And so the people in there, like, how can you buy into that line at all? But maybe where are the super criminals? The ones that do all sorts of, or are they just ghosts? I don't know. Like
they're super ghosts.
They're super ghosts.
They're poltergeists.
Oh no, they fuck with your shit.
Yeah, they toss shit around.
I knew a guy that was convinced that a poltergeist was moving his shit every night, and he was a heavy drinker. And
it turned out it was you.
It turned out it was me. It had nothing to do with his drinking problem. It was just me.
Why is my stuff all wet the next day?
You were drinking and going around and moving his stuff as a lark.
Yeah.
Taking a pee-pee on it.
So a woman, they were talking about a woman arrested for abandoning her child. That was Lee when she was talking about
how she tried to help the person.
She was not joking.
She was not. No, she wasn't, Lee.
To get this in joke, which is not much of an in joke, go listen to episode 1,
which most people had.
Yes, that's a highly rated episode. Go listen to episode 1 of the It's Got Star Trek podcast, where we discuss the cage and Where No Man Has Gone Before. Or alternatively, just watch Where No Man Has Gone Before, and you'll get the I'm not joking Lee joke.
So this woman, basically, her deal, kind of like, she was actually deemed a criminal and in this situation because she basically was abandoning her child, is what they said. Well, the thing is she couldn't afford to take care of her child because there's no jobs, because of all the fucked up shit that happens around, that a lot of times are out of people's control. So, but she did the best she could, right? She gave it to a family she trusted, but they said, you're abandoning it. She did the best she knew how when there were no options that a reasonable person could really have. And it's like...
And she was punished for it.
Yeah. It's kind of like if I beat someone up and then I yell at them for having a bruised face during picture time. That's what that's like, sort of.
Yeah.
But anyways, the idea, yeah, right. And so it's like being overpowered makes one a criminal. You're overpowered,
Right.
and now you're a criminal because you've been overpowered, you
Right.
know, and it's just
Yeah, exactly. And that is unfortunately
It's easy to somebody people that's already marginalized. It's easy to make them criminals.
right. So
It's
right,
just declare them,
it's just one step
categorize
away.
them,
Yeah, and-
categorize them
and-
as criminals.
yeah, and that's key. These take marginalized people. You call them whatever you want. You call them criminals. You call them this. You call them that. But it's all about sort of
Dims.
It's all about subjugating people in the end. You know.
Right.
So
we'll
it's,
call them this today, and tomorrow we'll call them something much worse.
yeah, and they have different names for it, you know, over time and stuff. And so, yeah, and so it's the criminal is the most sort of diplomatic way that they know how to put it because it's like, well, no, we don't want criminals, you know, running around and stuff like that.
And they
But-
do a good job. As she said, at one point she has a line. She says, "Look, the government just doesn't have enough money to pay for the things that we need." And then it goes to, you know, Dax hanging out at rich people's party. And it's like, all right, these people seem to have a lot of money. This guy's all talking about channel 100 or something. You know, whatever channels this
Channel
guy
90.
runs.
I thought it was two things. I thought it was weird that that guy serving the hors d'oeuvres, like they took the time to have him ask each person if they wanted an hors d'oeuvre, and it was like, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you.
It was padding out a 2-part. This is like a 1.5 part episode that they padded out with technobabble and hors d'oeuvres.
Yeah, right, yeah, and then
And Clint Howard.
And a little bit of Odo.
And the other thing was freaking Dax's hair. I couldn't figure it out for the longest time. At first, I was like, did they cut it in some weird way?
I could never figure out Dax.
But I think I guess in the back it was just in some kind of crazy bun going
it's
on.
always-
in the well, Dax's hair is usually pretty straight, isn't
always
it?
Yeah, normally it's that slicked back ponytail, active science officer.
She always ends up
Outfit.
in a slightly better position. Like, remember the other episode we talked about?
Yes, yes.
With the Odo memory business.
That's a good point. I
and like
hadn't made that
she
connection.
ends up and she ends up just like in like
She ends up fucking Damar.
Yeah,
I mean,
Ducat.
Ducat.
Yeah, that she's always getting some kind of inside scoop situation
Yeah.
where she gets like, in this case,
That's because she's got a worm in her belly.
she's got a wine,
A little worm in her
a
belly.
worm.
a cute little
without
wine.
a whine voice.
Yeah, the worm, the worm in her
If
belly.
the worm could talk, it would have a whine
Yeah, we
voice.
told you, say, hello, I'm Dex, I'm the worm.
But
I'm
this
is the
wriggling
Dax worm.
around.
That's absolutely true, though. Isn't
If you have sex with Dax, do you feel the worm wiggling around in her belly?
hope
If you're
so.
doing missionary? Or, I don't know.
Or-
I don't mean to be crude.
if you're doing
That depends
missionary?
if it reaches down.
It's a
that
thought.
far.
I
I don't know what that.
Does the Dax symbiote kind of reach down and tickle your...
What does the trill
Tickle the penis?
So-
anatomy look like?
So that was so both episodes it was interesting because she kind of got the inside scoop, but in one of them she was treated as like a subjugated person.
Slave person.
Yeah. And the other one she was taken in by that rich
But you're
guy.
right. The categorizing it is like
But
sort of
it's
the
a fine-
inside
it's a
track.
fine
She's
line.
not in. She's not in the prison because you're right. In that episode, they were also locked into. In that case, Tarek Noor.
Right.
She's sort of the way they get she's
Things
the spy.
passed.
Yeah. So,
Past
Right.
tense.
But she, it was interesting seeing her conversations with the. What was his name? Chris Brenner.
yeah,
I think is his name.
He had a weird delivery, kind of. It was funny, like for example, when she gave the line of "Then why do they put a wall around it?" He just kind of looked and like closed his mouth,
Yeah.
like all seriously or something, and it looked. I mean, I don't know.
I think that
kind of a weird.
This is
weird
not
character.
this is not a criticism of the episode. Partly, I'll give it some leeway because of the times it was made in. It was unclear exactly what his motivation was at the end because they were playing it kind of two ways. One, that he seemed like a nice guy who was trying to help out this woman who he found. He helped her out, and through conversation, she made a few points that really opened his eyes to some new way of thinking about things. Right? All right. That's a feasible thing. However, kind of simultaneously, it was being played as I found a hot lady unconscious in the metro. And I am going to now use any excuse to hang out with her, and I will use my power to impress her so that she'll sleep with me.
I think it's the Bart.
And I can determine, it's the
think that's
Bart
what they call
over
it
there.
out there,
Yeah,
Bart.
sorry, that's a DC-centric Mistake on my part. Yeah, the BART system. But yeah, he wanted to know if the spots went all the way down, I think. And they don't really
They
fall
do.
one way or the other. Even at the end when he's like, all right, because he's like, I'll get great ratings.
Yeah, right.
I'll lose my license, but I'll get great ratings.
It's like, yeah, right. You never really found out what his motivation
Yeah,
was.
so I don't know if he's become woke or not.
Yeah.
I think we're supposed to think he was because I think the idea is kind of if you can convince a powerful person like this, and she did convince him to at least open up the channels to let the regular folks tell their stories to the public so that the public would understand that these people were not criminals. They were merely had suffered some unfortunate circumstances and their community had not helped them in a meaningful way. In fact, their community hurt them under the guise of helping them.
I don't know what was going on with her hair, though. Like, when her hair, it looked like it was cut at that one
It's
part.
wild.
But it was like flipping underneath.
It's like he found her in the metro at the BART, and then he was like, "Let's get you a new wardrobe, and we'll get your hair styled."
And the hair,
Prices of
well, I'm just
cocktail
saying,
parties.
just how the
It's
hair
like
looked.
she's putting on hats.
It looked
Beware the guy who's going to go weirdly be asking you about hors d'oeuvres.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah, you do think he had a role in the show, but like he was the one who did it or something. But like her hair literally is long, and then it looked like they cut it, and it was short.
It was a
but it
bob,
wasn't
yeah.
short. It was a bob that had a little hangy bits to it.
Maybe the
Star Trek hair is so weird.
maybe despite the fact that they did not predict the internet correctly, they did not predict cell phones. They presumed that computers would be giant terminals and desks.
Embedded systems.
But maybe they, all that stuff is a little backwards, but maybe they had really advanced haircutting technology by 2024.
That's where they put their
Maybe
efforts
that's
in.
something we can look forward to. So on the one hand, total societal collapse and the ruination of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. On the other hand, really good haircutting technology.
All the Star Trek hair is weird though. Like all of those women look strange with their Star Trek hair, and then you see them in real life, and they're like, they don't look weird.
Did you ever see Zoe Deschanel without bangs?
Yeah, because,
no, don't do that.
Because some of the later seasons of that show, she doesn't have bangs anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
It's not worth looking at.
Troy always had some hair going on, right? She had some kind of hair going on.
I think that the smart move
Yeah,
with
and
Troy
it was never that great.
well, they were kind of like always changing up her hair, so it became a thing that she was always
Right.
changing up her hair. Whereas when the other characters did it, like you're pointing out right now with Dax, it is more jarring because you're like, whoa, that's different. She's supposed to look like this. I've categorized her like this. This is what she's supposed to look like. What the hell is going on out there with this hair?
Have we ever seen Kira with long hair and like a flashback or something like that?
Yeah, actually, there was one where I think she's like, I forget exactly, but she's like somehow with Ducat back in the day and her mom.
Ducat, don't do that.
Don't do that, Ducat.
But why, my dear? It will be wonderful. That's like their interaction all the time. Something.
All right.
I remember I was going to say about her interaction with that Chris dude. And throughout the episode, Dax was pretty quick to the punch. Like when she woke up, she's all spaced out and he's like, what's that thing on your chest or whatever? She's like, oh, my brooch. And then, when she's with Clint Howard, he's all talking about aliens. She's like, oh yeah, I know. There's aliens, right? I'm one too. And then he's like, that's incredible. All the things or spots. And she's like, oh, my tattoo, other times she was a
Did
little
you
bit,
get that in Japan?
other times she wasn't that, other times she wasn't that quick. With the
Jabroni?
with the jabroni pony.
But she was able to hack into
But
like their primitive.
But when he said who he was, she was like, who? Huh? And she's like, oh, that Chris Brenner. Like
Yeah.
that was pretty weak. Like I thought she could have done, considering how she'd done before. I don't attribute that to the writers. I just attribute that to Dax.
yeah.
Generally, Dax is pretty good at that sort of thing. We've seen that in a number of other episodes. And it's funny because on the one hand, it means she's quick thinking. On the other hand, it means she's really good at being duplicitous, which is, I'm sure
Well-
something you learn over the course of 7 or 8, lifetimes.
In different bodies and people
yeah.
trying to figure out, wonder who you are anymore.
Yeah, who am I?
Who am I?
So, all right, I think we should start wrapping it up. But I think there were just a couple things to go over. I think there were a couple of key lines.
Oh,
Go ahead, Dan.
I'm sorry. I don't know why I interrupted you to say this because it's not really important.
Now I'm keen to hear it.
Okay. Do you ever feel like it seems like Sisko, he basically robbed Bell of his legacy?
Yeah, I think that is. I do think that is a valid point, that like, he kind of did, although it still goes to his name. His
I mean, he
picture's
killed the
different.
guy.
He
got
didn't
killed.
want to.
I mean, if you really wanted to dig in and be super nitpicky about this episode, you could say, wait a second, how did nobody else notice when some other guy started saying he was... Gabriel Bell presumably had some sort of friends or associates.
Right, yeah.
Nobody else stood up and was like, no, that doesn't look like Gabriel Bell.
And then, right, and then of course, like the time, it's like, oh, the timeline's been restored
Yeah.
at the very end. It's just like, oh, even though it's a different person altogether, this is assuming that he wasn't him the whole time, because I don't think it was Sisko the whole time. It's just kind of like, oh, the timeline's restored to perfect. It's perfect. It's perfect.
Yeah, I know,
It's
right?
like, how do they know it's perfect?
It's Star
Yeah.
Trek. It's not even like Back to the Future where Marty gets a nice new car and his
Yeah.
dad's a sexy author.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to note was that just a couple of the other actors. So Bill Smitrovich, he's the guy who played Webb, and you just have to look up his IMDb because he's one of those guys. Like Dick Miller is a character actor who's been in a ton of shit that you know. This guy has been in a ton of shit you've watched, but you probably don't even remember. I mean, he's all over. Like, he was in Law and Order and Murder, She Wrote, especially during the 80s and 90s. So if you recognize his face, you do. He was in a lot of stuff. It's just he's usually a smaller character and usually not in some of the high profile stuff. He was an Iron Man though.
He's one of those guys that I'm so used to seeing him in things that it's hard for me to know exactly what I've seen him because it's been all over the place.
And then the other one that I thought was worth mentioning was Deborah Van Valkenburg.
Oh, right, from Too Close for Comfort.
She's from Too Close for Comfort. She played
Too
Jackie.
Close for
She's the one. She was the person who's sort of like the facilitator between the governor and the National Guard / riot police. And she's another person who she kind of pops up in stuff here and there, but you mostly will remember her from. Actually, most people will not remember her from Too Close for Comfort.
Most people listening to this podcast don't know that. It was a show in the 80s.
It was a show you don't need to watch, but
it's one of those shows you don't know why it existed.
But it's
really.
got Jim J. Bullock.
it does have Jim J. Bullock.
But it was entertaining. I watched it.
I watched
it.
I think I watched every episode.
Yeah, and I don't know
Ted
why.
Night.
I don't know why, because it didn't have anything particularly. Didn't have any.
It was on, and we were little, and we watched it.
It was a bizarre show. But I remember, I mean, she was 10, 15 years younger in that show. So she was playing a younger character than here. She's playing a more, mature, career advanced person. But anyway, I thought she did a good job in that particular role. She seemed legitimately troubled by the governor's decision to go ahead and do the attack. And again, as I mentioned, that attack, as brutal as it seemed, compared to what we're seeing right now, a very different situation. Of course, we're not talking about a hostage situation. We're talking about protests.
We're talking about something much worse.
I know I've seen. Speaking of characters or actors we've seen, a person who played Lee, I know I've seen her.
Yeah, I looked her up and nothing jumped out immediately, but she was in a lot of stuff. And also just a brilliant actress. I thought she played
South Central.
She had to play both the beleaguered civil servant and a frightened hostage and a hypoglycemic patient. And she played them all very, very well, very sympathetic. You really understood her plight, particularly in her role as a civil servant. And then when she's taken as a hostage, you're thinking, okay, now this poor woman is being frightened out of her wits for doing nothing more than her job. And even though that she can't do her job to the fullest of her abilities, because the structures, in this case, the social and political structures, will not permit her to do so.
So that was Tina Lifford.
The other police guy has been in some stuff as well.
Bernardo,
also voice acting.
Bernardo. The two people I looked up on IMDb that got my information look up because I hadn't seen them, but I feel like I wanted to because I'd seen the other ones, most of them. James Metzler, who played Chris Brenner, the rich guy.
Yeah.
Apparently he was in LA Confidential and Mad Men, a couple episodes, an episode of Dexter, I don't know, and just some stuff. And then there was the guy who played BC, who was a writer, Frank Military. That was the one who got the and blah blah as blah blah. You know how when they give the guest stars, they always give the last one that say and this as this.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's usually, I feel like it could be wrong, but it's usually implying like there's something significant and there's something different about it.
It's all negotiated by their agents, but it still it means something.
So
that's why they negotiate for it.
Yeah, he doesn't have a Wikipedia. He only has a IMDb page.
Yeah, he's a producer and writer known for Blind Faith, NCIS, and The Last Castle. I'm guessing he wrote those and produced them. So it's kind of, he had that funny thing where he's like, kind of as maybe, I don't know, I'm talking bullshit, but like he's a writer and producer and all this stuff. So he's acting this character that he's got all fleshed out in his brain, but he's just so ridiculous about it. There's something, ridiculous. It's kind of
the guy that
that
played Webb's son was on Saved by the Bell, the new class.
Oh, I did not know that.
So was, I think, the guy who played Cyclops. I think, what's his name? Cyclops. I think he was on the Saved by the Bell new class as well.
That sounds right.
As long as we're talking about people that we've seen in
well, so a couple other things to point out about this episode. First of all, since we did In the Pale Moonlight last week, I found it very interesting when Bashir early on in the story goes on that little spiel. Actually, I guess it's later on, but where he says, basically he's saying, what if the Federation started falling apart? Would we be any different than these people? Mm-hmm. Would we be any different than the Romulans or the Cardassians or these people? Yeah. And he specifically states, he says, would we be able to be true to our ideals? And as we saw in The Pale Moonlight, Sisko is faced with that challenge repeatedly, but in The Pale Moonlight, acutely faced with that, and does not necessarily meet the standards that Bashir is implying here. So I thought that was one thing to point out. And the other thing I was thinking about and wondering what your thoughts were about this, but this episode these days is often lumped together with episodes like In the Pale Moonlight, like Far Beyond the Stars, in terms of sort of the moral message, the cultural importance, also cited as key examples of the storytelling that Deep Space Nine can do, really tackling social issues directly head on, with much less artifice than even TOS was really good at addressing these fairly head on, but DS9 often dispenses with even the analogy and just goes straight into it.
Yeah.
But I think at the time, and tell me if I'm off base here, when I watched Far Beyond the Stars, when I watched In the Pale Moonlight, I recognized and felt the importance of those stories in the moment. Not that didn't happen with the past tense two-parter, or with, for example, the two-parter where the changelings infiltrate Earth and they do martial law. Mm-hmm. Both of those were important stories, and I took them seriously, but they became more serious later. Mm-hmm. That other two-parter with the martial law, that after September 11th, all of a sudden became
right. Yeah, you're saying
the paranoia.
You're saying In the Pale Moonlight, that was like immediately
you're like, oh my God, that's a very interesting story, and this story was more like, oh wow, that's a really interesting tale, But later, as the years have gone by, and by the way, all these protests and things that are going on now, this is not the first time people have looked to past tense and said, ooh, this is scary. We're getting close to what they're describing. And I think it was somewhat outlandish at the time, the idea that you would round up poor people and people with mental instabilities and shove them into ghettos. It was meant to be an exaggeration, a warning of where we could be going. And now, as the years have gone on, we're getting creepily closer to that.
And I think that's a key point, is that seems out at the time. It seems outlandish for various reasons, but it seems like such this sort of dystopia, and as time goes on, it's a combination of that. Also, just sort of like, you notice bits and pieces as time goes on, as it more relates. Whereas In the Pale Moonlight was just like this. It sort of lived on its own as a story.
It's all in there.
It's all in there. It's its own thing. It's like, this is war, man, and it's just this whole thing in and of itself, and it's all in there, right? Yeah, and this was the kind of thing where you see it, and then you start noticing little bits over time, and you recall it later. So
yeah, you're like, that would be fucked up, and then 10 years later, it was like, oh man, I hope we're not going in that direction, and then another 10 years later, you're like, oh fuck. Yeah. What are we going to do? And then that gets to, I think, a couple of the key lines. I mean, there's a lot of really great, expository lines in here, sort of talking about the moral tale. But one of them was, when Vin at the end is looking around at the carnage, and he says, how could we have let this happen? And Bashir says, the question is, how can we stop it from happening again? And that question remains I was about to say remains as important. I think it's even more important now. Not that there weren't problems in the 90s. Obviously there were. But we are now at a point where there are opportunities for change. And we really have to hope that it won't take a similar event as happened in this particular episode. Although, I guess, again, it's worth mentioning. I mean, they talk about this was the most violent event ever. Hundreds of people died. I thought there was a disconnect there because there have already been cases well before this where more people died. I mean, forget about domestically. Internationally, Tiananmen Square is 10,000 people.
I mean, I guess you could say, well, every life is, it's every death matters. So we want to, but you're right. At the same time, no, it's like, the number did seem like I hate to seem like it was 100 people. That's not enough people dead. But it's like
it's like we're talking about abstracting. It gets confusing. What's the number? But in this case, we do have hundreds of people over time dead. That's just talking about if we're talking about police shootings, and then forget about just 300 years of slavery, and then post Reconstruction Jim Crow and all that, and that's just for the marginalized Black community. Of course, there are other marginalized communities as well, and when you add them all up, it's pretty gruesome history that we've lived through. But the idea also is that hopefully we can, even if it's too slow, start correcting some of those mistakes. But there are these points, that there's a term of art called punctuated equilibrium, it's used in evolution, it's used in public administration studies, political science. And the idea is that you do have, you have little changes over time and they can build up and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what really happens is every now and then something happens. It could be an instigating event, or it could be just a confluence of a whole number of different sort of events and criteria that come together, but where all of a sudden things really change. And in this episode, the idea was that this riot that was where you ended up having the National Guard come in and effectively murder a bunch of people who were holding hostages, a crime in the loosest sense of the term, but it turned out they hadn't harmed the hostages, and then that really brought attention to the people. That was the focusing event. And
what put it over the edge though was when the law enforcement person off screen was fighting with the quote unquote dim, right? When there was a fight between, and that's sort of the point where the rioting really started. Yeah. So it was that. But then what the result of that is that after that things could have gone in many directions, but the result of that was this sort of hostage situation that went in that direction, and things continued and didn't fizzle out.
People took advantage of that to create a situation, not necessarily consciously, but to create a situation that did, at least as we're told, result in radical changes. And another example would be if you look at the killing of Archduke Ferdinand, that set off World War I, which was a complete fluke in so many ways. It was a failed assassination attempt. Basically, his car happened to go down an alley where one of the assassins was eating a sandwich, and ran out and was able to kill them. And because of the complex web of treaties between all the European countries, and they were interlocking treaties and all this stuff, as they refer to it, the powder keg, they made all these treaties with the idea of preventing war for all time.
They wanted to go to war.
And then in the end, that incident was enough to spark a history-changing event. And of course, there are a million other examples. But the question people have about the situation we're living with today is that the kind of situation we're in? History will tell. We can't say right now, but it does have the feeling. I think a lot of people think it has the feeling of something's happening, or there's an opportunity for something to happen because of the things that are going on.
When you said there was a disconnect between the hundreds of people that died and what you expected, I guess were you saying that like normally there would have been more?
No, I just meant there was a disconnect. Sisko was talking about how because hundreds of people died, that woke the public up. Mm-hmm. And the problem is we've seen examples where way more than hundreds of
Okay,
people
yeah,
died.
that's what I thought. That's what I thought you meant.
That, you
That's
know,
what I was
and again, the
responding to.
easy example is Tiananmen Square, but there are
Right.
other examples. There's the 1985, maybe it's not hundreds of people died. I think it was far fewer. But like when Philly bombed themselves. So if you don't know about this, go look up this story about 1985, how
The mayor of Philly.
the mayor of Philly actually bombed black people.
He dropped a
He
bomb.
dropped bombs on black housing developments. I'm not going to go into the details here. It is even more fucked up than you can possibly imagine from that brief summary. Go look it up on Wikipedia. That's an example. There were the examples of the companies who, when people were unionizing, like in the 20s.
My in-laws lived in Philadelphia at the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So there was the examples of like the unions, and they would have union towns and they set up big strikes. And then the companies would just hire mercenaries and go into these tent villages and just straight up fucking murder people with guns. Because that was how they were like, if you're going to unionize, if you're going to strike and not work in the factory, we're just going to murder you until we murder enough of you that the rest of you are like, okay, maybe I'll go back to work.
Or they used like the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
These are things that happened. And by the way, a lot of these things, when they did happen, they did foment some change, not necessarily enough change, but there was a backlash against murdering the workers and their families and their children. So anyway, we're in a tricky time because, for a lot of us, certainly us on this podcast, we grew up mostly in the 80s and 90s. Those were our formative years. There was bad stuff going on, but we grew up as white people, relatively privileged, beyond even the standard white privilege that goes in there. And, we
Got some
weren't
DC privilege.
we weren't raised as shitheads. So we weren't completely ignorant of what was going on out there. But the point being, when we're watching Star Trek in that time period, we're not necessarily equating it with reality. We might be associating it with historical events or potential far off future events. We weren't really making that connection on a episode by episode basis anyway, right? In terms of reality. And that was, TOS, when that was on, that was making points about the Vietnam War when the Vietnam War was still going on. It was making points about communism and capitalism when the Cold War was really at its hottest, right? And Deep Space Nine, these stories that they're telling, they are over the years have become more and more relevant in that sense, and in the sense that we can actually maybe learn something from them, or at least be, think about these topics a little bit more. And we don't need Star Trek to think about these topics, but fiction can serve a really good purpose in terms of kind of consolidating things and streamlining things to really get at some of the points that sometimes when you're living through reality is always complex to begin with, but when you're living through such a complex reality and things are so confusing and anxiety producing, and it can be really a fucking wall of noise, and fiction can do a really good job of helping organize that. And it's so cool that the fiction does not have to be written today. You can rely on older fiction like Past Tense to look at the current situation in a different way, maybe become inspired to come up with some ideas to try to help it, try to take advantage of the situation, to move things in the direction we'd like to see, which is in some ways a Star Trek style future.
Yeah. The thing is it's hard to define the moment you're living in as it's happening, because it's still defining itself. And like you said, there's so many things you're trying to process. That's why after the fact, you can kind of look back and sort of see how things panned out in that unit you decide to separate it into. So, and the story. Yeah, I did say unit. You said something else too. You said like
Look at the unit on that.
You said
guy.
something too earlier.
Penis.
That's what she said.
So yeah, I mean Sisko, they sort of ended it. They drove it home with the point of Bashir basically saying, how could they have let things get so bad? And it ends with Sisko going, that's a good question. I wish I didn't answer, which is just kind of like a little reminder, a little punch to remind you of just like how it's relevant, I guess.
It is. And there are answers out there, right? There are answers out there. The truth is out there. The X-Files was 100% correct. But it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work, and it's work that's worth.
Takes a lot of pain.
It's worth
Is that
doing.
how the song goes?
it's worth doing that work
Which song is that?
to have a better understanding
Love hurts.
of the history of the world, of our country, and not just the far history, but how that history continues to play out, and simultaneously, and again, I think this is where fiction can be very helpful, to understand that we are not beholden to the history. We are not required to repeat history, quote unquote. I always hate that, because what happens is humans have we have pattern finding brains. So we look back into history and it's really easy to cherry pick stuff and see see, history always repeats itself. That's true to some surface extent, but when you really dig
Cervix,
into
you said cervix.
it's true
Sorry
to
to
some
get you back.
cervix extent.
That's just because you're looking for patterns.
You're
yes.
looking for patterns, and you can't help it.
Devo has an awesome song called Patterns.
I bet they do. Devo is really awesome.
The human mind can't help it. So we have to fight against that a little bit, at least insofar as to understand we are under no obligation to keep doing things the way we're doing. We never were, but we certainly never are now. And it's one of my pet peeves about the adherence, the slavish adherence to quote unquote tradition.
Right.
I got nothing against tradition. I'm an anthropologist by background. But the lessons I took away from studying anthropology was that tradition can be extremely maladaptive. Nothing wrong with tradition as a concept, but as an unexamined concept, as a concept that's just coldly and blindly taken to be the case.
For its own sake.
That's where it can become a problem, because you can have some benign traditions, you can have some very good traditions, but you can also have some very bad traditions. And those traditions can, whether by design or not, can uphold social and political and policy structures that have ruined people's lives and are continuing to ruin people's lives. And just because you're in a position where you might perceive that your life isn't currently ruined, how do you know that? How do you know how much better your life could be if more people in your community and more people in your country were also living good lives, right? It is sort of the lie of the story of America in a lot of ways, although this is, I think, true in a number of places, that no, if you've got it good, you've got it good because you deserve to, and you have to protect that, and you got to fight against those people who are trying to take it away. No, what about, why don't we give a try of having everyone do pretty well and see if that, maybe I'll do even better. Maybe I'll have a boat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just because other people want good things too doesn't mean they're trying to take things from you. Although there is
it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah,
right,
and
exactly.
And so that's the concern though, is well, if these people have, if this group has,
they're not canceling you out.
If these people that aren't me, part of the people that I associate with, if they get some stuff too, that means I'm going to lose some stuff. And there is
in no way whatsoever.
And people are, and it goes back to it's are you losing your rights, or are you just or is the privilege evening out a little bit more, or is that the goal?
Well,
I'm not trying to assert that privilege is currently equaling out. What I'm saying is when people interpret it as losing rights, and that argument has been, I know it's been brought up before.
The fact is, so there's two facts. First of all, economics is not a zero-sum game. We know it isn't, because our entire economic structure is built on growth, right? Literally, it's built on growth. That is how that's how our economic structure works. Most of the structure of both the Western and Eastern worlds at this stage.
It's about consumption, and that's the thing about Star Trek is the scarcity situation.
That's one thing, is that the economy is not a zero-sum game. And by the way, there's lots of different economies, and it's never a zero-sum game, right? Even if they think it is, it's not, because that's not how the fucking
it's
universe.
just really inefficient. People are really inefficient.
The universe does not work that way. But it's also that there's an old saying that says, if you have privilege, then equality does feel like a downgrade. Mm-hmm. In other words, it is true that if part of what makes your life better is that you have more access to things, more impunity, more ability to do what you want, because those things you want to do are only work in the context of somebody else not getting to do them, then you're going to lose out a little bit.
Right. Well, people are used to who are used to getting put to the front of the line. Some now suddenly need to wait with other people. They feel like they've lost rights. And the thing is, they do, because they feel like, well, I earned. That's the problem, is they didn't earn the front of the line. I earned the front of the line. And it's what did you do to earn the front of the line?
I was born.
Yeah.
My daddy gave me some money.
Yeah.
And my mommy gave me some money.
My daddy gave me some money, huh? Hey, Mr. Miyagi, huh? My daddy.
And another
Everybody's daddy gave him some money.
the other example, right? That's really kind of funny. It's somewhat unrelated, but I think you can transpose it onto a lot of other things. They've done a bunch of mathematical models about hiring people, right? Hiring and promoting people, right? And there's this old term called the Peter Principle that basically says that you will get promoted to the level of your incompetence.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So in other words, you do a good job, so they promote you. You do a good job in that position, so they promote you. And then you get
because the problem is promotions often don't involve doing this like the same style of thing. You just move to a different. It's like you move from you're good at some tech stuff, and then suddenly you're put in management.
And if you don't have those skills or didn't get some training or something, there's no reason to think you'll do better. So what happens is you end up with a lot of corporate and government and other organizational, even nonprofit structures where you can have people who are not, they weren't bad at, they weren't like entry level terrible people. They were really good up to a point, but they eventually got promoted to a position where the reason they're still in that position and haven't been promoted again is because they're no longer very good at that position. And you can get whole organizations with these people, right? And so there was a team that did some mathematical modeling to figure out how can you get around this. And what they found was the way to get around it. Any guesses? What's the way to get around the Peter Principle?
The principle of people who get promoted to
their level of incompetence. How do you avoid that happening in an organization? Any guesses?
I've always heard of this term where people outprice themselves and they eventually let them go to get new people at the bottom to like go up.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what you're.
No, that's a different factor. So okay, so now granted, this is just mathematical modeling. I don't think anyone's actually tried this. But what they concluded is they ran all these simulations using a bunch of different models, and the model that produced the most effective company structure was to promote people randomly.
Oh.
Because by promoting people randomly, sometimes people would get into a job. Like, for example, I guarantee you we all know people or feel this about ourselves where you're like, the position I'm in, I'm effective, but I frankly would be way more effective if I was in this other position. Mm-hmm. But you don't have access to that position because you have to climb the ladder or whatever. And maybe you can't climb the ladder because one of the rungs is something that you're not particularly good at. Mm-hmm. And it's totally irrelevant to being good at that other position. You might be really great at being an upper level. Like, look at that King of the Hill episode with Dale Gribble, and it turns out he's really good at firing people, so they make him a vice president because he doesn't care. So
because he kills bugs, so he's good at terminating things.
and he was terrible at the data entry job, but he's really good at the high level vice president of human resources.
Because one would
job.
think that there still would be a system out there that's better than random, but if random is better than what we have, then right.
Well, that's an important caveat. Obviously, there could be other scenarios out there, but it
shows that we got a system that seems like common sense is actually quite the opposite.
And it gets to people's, and again, it gets to my little thing about tradition and sort of just in general cultural positions that lock people into certain philosophies, even if those philosophies are not necessarily good for society or even for themselves. And another example, two other examples. One of them is basic minimum income. A lot of people are against it just based on the fact that they don't want people to get free money from the government. They just think that's wrong. And they're like, I don't want people playing video games all day. Even though, again, a lot of the modeling suggests if you give people money, you basically get rid of homelessness. You give people money and healthcare. You eliminate homelessness. You get people in a capitalist system working in the function that they are best suited to, right? And you'll get some people just sitting around playing video games all day, but who the fuck cares? Who the fuck cares if it increases the economy around and if more people are doing what they want to do?
That's even like a right-wing idea. That's not a left-wing
idea. It's kind of a hybrid idea.
Yeah.
So wait, when you said earlier, what did you say? We were an evergreen podcast? Does that mean we stay away from politics?
That just means it's timeless.
No. Not from politics. We can talk about politics, but like,
I'm not saying we shouldn't. I was just curious. I'd never heard that term before.
The idea is you don't want somebody listening to this podcast 10 years from now being like annoyed or confused.
It's
that makes sense.
The topicality of the situation.
Yeah.
So
no,
I don't mind.
I didn't mean that as a criticism. I was just curious because that reminded me because You know,
I
I guess
don't mean-
we can't talk about this episode without sort of, you know, and not saying we shouldn't. But,
And
I said Trump was a pussy, and you can say Trump is a pussy,
that's an evergreen statement.
but that's all right.
That's an evergreen statement. And it's okay to mention key, huge events that are happening.
I'm not a fan of Trump. I'll say. I'll go ahead and say
It's
it.
totally
But it's not something that. Yeah.
Okay,
it's-
but real quick, the last example that's similar to the employment example is that I believe has been tried out in some cultures, ancient and current, but maybe is something that needs to be tried out more, is that instead of electing people in government or promoting people in government, that again, random assignment seems to work better because you separate people from the chain of moneyed influences and business influences. And by the way, it's not just businesses, it's also unions and
yeah,
nonprofit
that's
groups.
an issue of motivation too.
So if you had a system where somebody is like in charge and they make decisions for 2 weeks, and I'm not advocating for the system, but I'm just citing it as an illustration, that then that person no longer has that tie. They're not looking to make hundreds of thousands of dollars as a lobbyist, so they might actually care about the job they're doing, and especially if it's in a local community where it will affect them directly. But that's something where they've also run models on, and there's some promising ideas there, but it's just antithetical to what we've been raised with, which is no, you have a class of people and they're called politicians, and they're slimy and we hate them, but we need them. And then you have a class of people who are civil servants, and a class of people who are businessmen, and a class of people who are consumers, and then, oh, by the way, we're built into all this is we're gonna have a class of people who we shove to the fucking margins and treat like shit, because the only way we can feel like we're good people is if we have somebody we can point to and say, those are shitty people, I'm not them, that means I'm a good person. And I have a problem with that structure, and I don't think it has to be that way. And again, I think the great lesson from history is we are not beholden to it. We can imagine whatever future we want. Star Trek is one example. There are lots of others, and we can work towards it. And I don't think that's a meaningless activity to work towards that, to work towards a more hopeful future, even if the challenges are quite large.
I'm always troubled when people are just blanketly say that politicians are just a bunch of crooks and criminals, and it's like, well, that's not true. I mean, you can't just say that about everybody. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about politicians that's not savory and nice, but like
there's the motivation for having a job like that can be inclusive of people who obviously just want to get their shit, you know,
Yeah.
and just
Depends on context and location.
Totally context and location. And that, yeah, and I wouldn't pigeon, and that's, I guess, where some people get that idea that they're all like that, but they're not.
Exactly.
Right?
It's that categorization problem.
Right,
It's like that's a category.
I can't remember which philosopher was talking about the despotic leader or whatever, and there was something about how democracy leads to despotic leaders. Despotism, because it's like this. I think I'm butchering this probably, but
if you can get the support of millions of people,
yeah, it's
that's
basically
problematic.
Yeah, it's like basically your whole mission is to like get people to like you. Basically, that comes down to that, and sort of like, you know, and you sort of and you don't lead people because of what you think is right. It's
even if you do, what you think is right is based on your own perspective and context, and maybe because you're a politician, because you're of a certain mindset, that constrains your perspective to being one that's not particularly socially great.
Yeah. So
I mean, they talk about in the third Hitchhiker's Guide book, Life, the Universe, and Everything. There's a whole kind of subplot in there that they basically talk about how anyone who's able to gain power is the last person who should be able to have it.
Right.
You
I
know,
remember if that was Aristotle or Plato or
Socrates,
or it could be Socrates.
Euripides.
Nuts off.
Eumenides.
Right.
Aristophanes, he was a playwright.
They mentioned
He wrote plays.
He wrote the frogs.
They mentioned Alpha Centauri.
They did mention Alpha
just a couple
Centauri.
things I want to get out before.
All right, get him out, boy. We got to close up shop,
They
boy.
mentioned Proxima, and that's where
So,
Proxima Centauri.
I think it was
Klingon.
I think it was
Romulans.
I think it was last week or the week before where we were talking about Alpha Centauri, and you were just like, "Fucking Alpha Centauri, who gives a shit about that?"
Quadro Triticale.
They mentioned it. They got subspace signals from the Romulans. They were detected Romulan subspace.
that was the.
What were the Romulans doing in Alpha Centauri?
Well, nobody else. Well, because the
Federation was
there was
there.
no Federation, so the Romulans had
were just
expanded
there.
into the Alpha Corps.
Is that what that's where they live in Alpha Centauri?
Yeah, they got their Korean Romulan spas that they walk around in.
Cool.
That's a
pretty
Picard
cool.
joke. Go watch Picard.
Yeah, watch that shit.
another thing is that this was directed by Jonathan. Part 2 was directed by Jonathan
It was
Frakes.
a Frakes, yes.
And then the first one, I know I'm going to be butchering this name.
Reza.
Is it Reza? It's not Reza. It's Reza.
It could be
Rizzo?
Reza. It's like Reza Badiyi. Badiyi. I don't know how to pronounce. I feel terrible.
Yes, an Iranian American director. Yes.
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to mention was other than the purple and green seas, it was kind of weird how like in Daxland they have purple seas, and in Kiraland they have some kind of like green algae seas or something. I don't know, because they at the beginning they were like talking about how blue it was, and then Dax was saying that should be more purple, and Kira was saying it should be more green. For some reason,
should have more worms.
It
should just be worms crawling all over the place.
O'Brien, did they ever mention this distinction? O'Brien saying he was an enlisted man.
Yes,
he said that's why I was enlisted, so I didn't have to go to the symposium for the Gamma Quadrant.
That's his. Yeah, that was his big. That's why I'm not an officer speech.
Yeah.
So he's enlisted.
He's always been enlisted, except early on in TNG, he was he had like ensign pips or something.
So
he was the con.
So everyone else went to officer school, and he just enlisted. Not just enlisted.
I'm sure he got training at Starfleet because he talks about Starfleet Academy, I think, but he must have been training in the enlisted corps. He didn't, so it's not like the same thing as going to Annapolis or West Point to be an officer. But yeah, O'Brien is the everyman. That's why they torture him and treat him like shit at all times. Like when Picard was like, transporter room 3. That's your favorite transporter room.
That's all you got is this fucking
that's
that
what you
one.
like.
That's what you like.
That's my major interaction.
That's your world.
That's your thing. That defines you. Is that you like this transporter
You're the
room.
transporter man.
Check the Heisenberg compensators. Was that I don't even know.
That sounded, I was like, who is that? Is that Odo?
It sounded more like Odo. I started trying to go for O'Brien, and then about a half second.
O'Brien.
Yeah, exactly. About a half second in, I was like, I'm not going to go for this. But I was already doing some kind of
because he doesn't do a comical American doing an Irish accent. He like a Lucky Charms accent. He does. He's an actual Irish person.
Irish guy
who speaks with a normal Irish. Well, normal-ish. I've interacted with a number of Irish people. Lovely folks. Difficult to understand sometimes, especially after a few drinks. I'm sure they could say the same about me with my rhotic American speech patterns, mid-Atlantic speech patterns. Mm-hmm. All right, so I think that does it for this episode.
10,000 people in 20 square blocks.
Yeah. That's a lot of that.
So I'm sure that was an approximation.
Is that a lot?
I don't know. At first I was like, that's a lot. But then I was like, all right. I know cities have a lot more people than you think.
So, Dan, tell our audience if they want to let us know, if they want to do the calculation by square footage and blocks and average blocks in San Francisco. If somebody out there, if a city planner, if somebody out there wants to do the calculation, where can they reach us?
And also tell us how it compares to New York City. You can reach us at It's Got Star Trek at feedback.com.
Okay.
Feedback.com.
All right. Sorry, audience. I know we go through this.
Oh, no, wait. It's feedback.
I have no doubt you all think this is a bit. This is not a bit.
It's a bit.
This is not a bit. Jesse and I are concerned.
Do I have a bit of the stupid?
No. Are you a dim?
I'm sorry. Is it? I'm dim. I am a dim. Sorry, it's feedback.
Why would we have a website called feedback.com?
I don't know. Because we locked in early. We locked it in early.
All right. So they want to tell us, they want to give us facts and figures.
Feedback.
And comments and questions.
Feedback at itsgotstartrek.com. No apostrophe.
Excellent. No apostrophe. There's an apostrophe in real life, but not in the website.
Because that would be ridiculous.
As you all know, the web protocols can't stand that shit.
Because they use them for escape characters and things like that.
Punctuation is from the Middle Ages.
All right. So, feedback at itsgotstartrek.com. What if they want to find us on social media?
I don't know.
At It's Got Star Trek.
Very good. And that works on Twitter. It works on Instagram. I think it works on Facebook too.
Facebook has some kind of half implementation.
But you can definitely search for us on Facebook. We've got a Facebook page you can follow. And
like and subscribe.
You can do all that stuff. You can find us on the Overcast, on the Spotify, on the Twitter, on
Stitcher,
on the Stitcher, and Google Play. We also throw shit up on YouTube. And what's really great is if you go check out our videos on YouTube, you can see we get weird comments from bots. Like one guy just is always leaving a comment saying, "I love you." And that's
that's
disturbing.
nice.
No, it's not nice. It's horrifying.
That's sweet.
It's a robot, or I mean, it's worse if it's a real
I love
person.
you.
I love you.
I am lonely.
It's an irresponsible comment. I love you.
It is crazy, and we get some crazy comments on the website. They don't ever show up on the website because obviously we moderate those, so we get a bunch of spam comments.
You know, that comment on the Apple it was the iTunes or whatever.
Yeah, well, Apple Podcasts.
Apple
is now what they call
Podcasts,
it,
yeah, whatever it's called.
But you can see it in iTunes. as
Yeah,
well.
that was cool. I appreciate that, and I just realized I didn't make a joke for that. But I guess like,
All right. Do you want to make a joke?
well, I kind of like followed up when someone said intense. I said like a fire at the circus, but that was off the cuff. That wasn't making a joke for situation. I guess I can make a joke, but not now. I can't think of anything now.
Make a joke now.
What do you get when you cross a bagel with a shopping cart?
Bagel cart. A bagel shopping cart.
A copping shart.
That does that
What?
does that have anything to do with anything?
No.
I mean, I just came up with that shit, yo. I can
All right.
I can mold that.
I will give you.
or just leave it as
I will
it
give you
is.
props
That's
for
raw.
coming
That's
up
raw
with
comedy.
That's raw comedy.
that. Raw dogging. Dan is raw dogging the comedy. Every Tuesday night at the Comedy Flim Flam on 18th Street, on the corner of 18th and you.
Raw dogging it every
Check
night.
out Dan
Raw Dog
Lovitz.
Comedy
at Exposed.
with Dan the Man, comedy man. You can get more of this humor.
If you like raw dog,
Yeah. So, a very good 2-part episode, very interesting, disturbingly prescient for our times. So it was good to watch this. We haven't decided what we're going to watch next week. Any ideas, or should we stave it off and push people to our social media to figure it out? Unless you had some
somebody
things that
tell
jumped
us
out.
what
Well,
to
I
talk
mean,
about.
Is there something, and I don't mean this in any way other than I'm wondering, is there a general like vibe that we're trying to avoid TNG or something?
No, I like.
Or is it played out at this point? Because
we did Thine Own Self.
yeah, well, no, I know that.
I love me some
I
TNG.
was just saying, like, it's been a while since we've done a TNG.
Been a while.
been a while.
Do you have a particular TNG episode you are interested in doing? Now the question is do you want to do something? We've been doing a lot of sort of heavy moral stuff.
Yeah, I don't want to do like Inner Light or anything.
You want to do
like
something
that.
goofy and fun?
Yeah, it depends on what kind of goofy and fun. I don't want like.
You don't want to do a fistful of datas, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I don't even know about a Q episode either, but it would have to depend.
There's Cause and Effect, which is always good.
I like the one where he which the one where he loses his Q status? Or is that a different show?
No,
It's like
that's this
they
show.
show the continuum on it. But what was the one you said? Cause and Effect? Yeah, we could do Cause and Effect.
Cause and
Let's do
Effect.
Cause and Effect.
You want to do Cause and Effect? How about you, Jesse?
Just something fun.
Yeah, that's cool.
There's some time travel stuff. It's
Yeah,
fun, and it
yeah.
kind of harkens back to some of the goofiness to make a madman go barmy. Well,
Go
you know,
barmy.
Yeah.
Balmy.
The
Balmy.
Discovery episode.
It's so balmy out here.
All right. It's been
so-
settled.
What would you do?
We'll do Cause and Effect next week. So we'll see you then. And in the meantime, Dan is still working on a very complex algorithm to automatically select the shows
yeah.
for us so we don't have to have this goofy little conversation at the end.
Yeah, I
We could
know.
also be more professional and actually have this conversation before the podcast, but that would defeat the purpose of being lively and fun and spontaneous.
It would defeat the poipus.
It would defeat this full of
Wait. Why was the dolphin something? Because it would defeat the poipus.
Yeah.
Something.
Gabriel Bell's body's full of worms.
Get it? Dolphin,
All sorts of worms
poipus.
crawling out
Get
of
it?
his eyeballs.
Dolphin and poipus?
All right.
Or porpoise. Porpoise, poipus.
It's a porpoise.
On that note, we will call it a night.
We'll call it a scene.
We thank you all. We'll see you next week with Cause and Effect. In the meantime, we hope everyone else out there is safe and happy and, doing things. Go do some things. Whatever things you think are fun to do. Go do some things.
That's Jesse doing that.
Within the confines of the COVID-19 quarantine, which is the other insane thing that's happening. One of the other insane things is happening. As somebody noted that, there was that whole scare for the murder hornets, but then when all the rioting and
Murder hornets.
and the protesting started, people were like, the murder hornets were just like, fuck this, I'm not
gives a
coming.
fuck?
They're flying home. They're not going to stay. So anyway,
Not safe here for murder hornets.
we hope you all have a lovely evening, weekend, week, etc. And we'll talk to you next week with Cause and Effect. Good night.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Come in.
How do you feel?
Better.
I thought you might like to see this. I found it in the historical database.
I'm not looking forward to explaining this to Starfleet Command.
Well, at least it's a good picture. You know, Commander, having seen a little of the 21st century, there is one thing I don't understand. How could they have let things get so bad?
That's a good question. I wish I had an answer.